If you weren't around in the early to mid 2000s to experience the Nicktoons Unite era, I genuinely feel sorry for you. Crossovers weren't exactly a new concept, but they had never been done on this kind of level outside of comic books. Across the course of the series, these games allowed players to control characters and explore iconic locations from basically every Nicktoon ever made. Today we're throwing it back to a simpler time when licensed games were everywhere, and SpongeBob joining forces with Jimmy Neutron was the most important thing to happen in your life. Interconnected universes and crossovers were the coolest thing to me as a kid, and honestly in general I think most kids find this to be a pretty cool concept. Arguably the biggest reason why I preferred Cartoon Network over Nickelodeon as a kid, despite liking plenty of shows from both channels, is because of things like Cartoon Network City. The idea that all of these shows were inhabiting the same universe, having unique interactions with one another that you wouldn't normally find in the actual shows themselves, it's just such a cool concept. While Cartoon Network did a great job with this on the channel, it never really made it to home console video games. They dabbled in this with flash games like Cartoon Summer Resort, which I hope is unlocking a core memory for you right now, and also the underappreciated Fusion Fall MMO that I really hate myself for never playing during its peak. But it wasn't until 2016's Battle Crashes that they actually tried a console crossover that wasn't a racing, fighting, or party game. While Nickelodeon always struggled, at least for me personally, to create a unique shared universe vibe around their actual channel, they struck gold with their Nicktoons Unite series. The idea that all these different Nicktoons are being brought together across the multiverse to work together and defeat a common enemy had me so hyped as a kid, and honestly just as hyped as an adult. Because I'm a glutton for nostalgia, I'm going to be taking a look back at the 5 different Nicktoons titles: the often forgotten Freeze Frame Frenzy, Nicktoons Unite, Battle for Volcano Island, Attack of the Toybots, and Globs of Doom. These releases also had a bunch of handheld versions, so we're going to be taking a trip back through 12 different games. And on top of that, I'm also going to be ranking each and every one of them to find out which are worthy of a Nickelodeon Kids' Choice Awards blimp, and which are worthy of getting slimed. How many of these will actually hold up compared to the pedestal we all put them on as kids? But first, if you're obsessed with Nickelodeon video games, and just games based on cartoons in general like me, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss a video. And leave a comment down below letting me know which Nicktoons Unite game was your favourite. And also let me know which thumbnail showed up for you on this video. YouTube lets me A/B test multiple thumbnails now, so which one do you prefer? But enough of that, let's take a look at the first Nicktoons crossover game that kicked off this iconic series. What are we, some kind of Nicktoons Unite?
Say that again?
This is what you were all waiting for. Nicktoons Unite was serviceable on both of the handhelds, but it's the PS2 and GameCube versions that were the holy grail growing up. And just as I expected, the story is essentially the exact same thing here, except expanded upon in much greater depth. The slightly more cinematic feel is immediately on show in the opening cutscene. Instead of being immediately hit in the face with Calamitous bringing together all of the villains, you see Plankton taking over Bikini Bottom before Goddard shows up like he's Nick Fury or something. For all you voice acting aficionados, you'll be pleased to see that this game has brought all of the iconic voices in to give life to the story, and they really don't skimp on it. These unique character interactions you won't find anywhere else are basically the whole appeal of Nicktoons Unite, and it's a relief that Blue Tongue managed to nail this. Story moments are far more rewarding here than in the GBA and DS versions, so even if you're not digging the gameplay, die-hard Nick fans will probably still want to play it through to the very end. It really feels like Blue Tongue wanted to please fans here. You see so many side characters from shows pop up for a brief moment or two, and it's filled with enough references that make me believe a lot of people on the dev team were either Nicktoon fans or they went out of their way to immerse themselves in the source material.
Hi, Kevin.
Little touches like Cindy making a small reference to the Jimmy Timmy Power Hour when she sees Timmy take this from being just a game featuring Nicktoons to being a genuine Nicktoons game.
Hi, Cindy. Oh, hi, Timmy. I didn't know you were back in Retroville.
And I think this caring touch extends over to the character models. It's such a tough task bringing together characters from shows with different art styles, especially when most of those shows are 2D. Jimmy should naturally fit well here, although Globs of Doom's cutscenes show that it can still be fucked up, and you've still got to take Butch Hartman's style and SpongeBob style and translate those into 3D. Blue Tongue did a really good job, and when you give those models a little extra juice and bump them up to 1080p, they really shine. Hell, compare SpongeBob or Danny to their most recent Nickelodeon All-Star Brawl counterparts, and they hold up surprisingly well. Danny does run kinda weird though, like he's got a stick stuck up his ass or something, so it's not perfect. And then Blue Tongue bust out puddles with actual reflections in them, which blew me away. Maybe my video game development ignorance is shining through here, but this isn't something I was expecting to see in a licensed PS2 or GameCube game. Reflections are notoriously hard to get right in games. I've got to give a special shout out to the soundtrack as well. They did a great job of both capturing the feel of each show with some of the tracks, while also sprinkling in some more cinematic moments that make this feel like a grand adventure. It gets weirdly beautiful at times in the SpongeBob levels. Some of these songs made me feel like I was playing Ni no Kuni or something. So Blue Tongue has ticked a couple of crucial boxes when it comes to the story and presentation, but for Nicktoons Unite to be a truly great experience, the gameplay has to be up to par too. And the kind of game we have here is pretty unique for Nickelodeon. Nicktoons Unite feels like it was massively inspired by X-Men Legends, which had released the year prior. I actually haven't played either of the X-Men Legends games or the Marvel Ultimate Alliance series that spawned out of those, but from what I've seen, it feels like it was the inspiration for Unite. These games are referred to as action RPGs on Wikipedia, which feels like such a nebulous and unhelpful description. In my experience, Unite is a kind of 3D beat 'em up. You basically go from room to room clearing enemies, but then you also have a greater emphasis on traversal and puzzle solving that you wouldn't really see in a traditional 2D beat 'em up. Each character has a standard attack, a ground pound to stun enemies, and a shield to block incoming attacks. Everybody also gets special moves which are tied to the purple meter you'll see at the top of the screen. One of the big problems I quickly encountered here is that the 4 characters are not nearly different enough for a game like this. Something like X-Men Legends or Marvel Ultimate Alliance works because most of the heroes have such distinct abilities. It's super obvious what sets apart characters like Wolverine, Storm, and Cyclops. But most of the Nicktoons cast here aren't natural fighters, and that's kind of where the problems start. Basically, 2 of the characters are ranged attackers here and 2 are melee. Timmy and Jimmy are the ranged attackers, and the devs kind of tried to make them different. Jimmy's airgun thing is akin to a shotgun, mostly effective at close range. Timmy on the other hand is able to fire much more quickly and hit targets from a distance. But Timmy is clearly the better option to use, because every character's firepower is the same. Well, at least it felt like they were to me. Timmy can shoot quicker and from further distances, so why wouldn't I just use him? Jimmy seems like he'd be a good option for close quarters crowd control, especially later on when all of your characters get charge attacks, but this neglects the fact that every enemy encounter you have starts with you running in from a distance. There's not much point to a shotgun character if I'm able to pick off enemies from a distance with Timmy before I even get close enough to be effective with Jimmy. The same thing extends to Danny and SpongeBob, who are both melee characters. Again, they both appear to do the exact same amount of damage, but SpongeBob's combat feels way more fluid than Danny's. I'm really not being given any incentive to use Danny here. And Blue Tongue really missed the mark with melee combat in general. It's so unsatisfying to use. It lacks that real crunch and impact here, so fights feel unspectacular. It's like there's no weight behind any of your attacks. Characters start to diverge a bit from their standard archetype as you gather new abilities that the game gifts to specific characters at certain spots. These can be used in combat situations, but are often cumbersome and you'll probably just utilize them for their puzzle solving and traversal aspects. But it's here that the characters are really made to feel like themselves and unique. Danny gets the Overshadow ability to take over the body of a stunned enemy, he gets the Ghostly Wail, and he can phase through certain walls. Jimmy gets a gadget to shrink objects and enemies, Timmy switches into his cleft alter ego, which makes him the game's third melee character technically, as well as getting a freeze gun and the ability to heal the team. And SpongeBob gets a bubble bomb alongside using Doodlebob to lure enemies and being able to suck up and spray water. While there's not a whole lot of incentive to switch away from using the game's best characters when purely looking at the combat, Blue Tongue does a great job of forcing you to switch because of these abilities. The gameplay is so heavily focused on combining all of these abilities to keep moving forward that you just naturally start playing as everybody. So while it's not perfect, you will spend a decent amount of time playing as every character. And the game has got a surprising amount of depth to it. You've got an upgrade system here which allows you to upgrade the attack and special abilities of each character. Upgrades always bring a new wrinkle, so it feels like the gameplay is constantly evolving. It does help remove the typical monotony that tends to set in with a beat 'em up style game. To upgrade characters, you collect NRG tokens that are scattered around levels, and they get dropped by defeated enemies or destroyed objects. It's the only Nickelodeon game I'm aware of that rewards you for defiling graves. Unless you're extremely thorough with your collecting, you won't have upgraded every character completely by the end of the game, so a little bit of strategy seeps in here. Although you're probably going to favour upgrades for SpongeBob and Timmy if you're anything like me. Naturally, each section of the game is concluded via a boss battle with one of the bad guys from the shows represented here. The ideas behind these boss battles aren't necessarily bad, but they suffer the same issue as the DS's Plankton fight. They are all so ridiculously long. It's gotta be the most annoying set of boss battles I've ever encountered. Generally, they all follow the format of having to disable some sort of shield or armor before being able to damage the boss, but it takes so long to do it. The worst of these is the Crocker boss battle. It felt like the game was tempting me to turn it off and never return with how tedious it was. You always only have a brief window to chip away at the health before the shield returns, and it ends up taking forever, particularly because your AI teammates are useless. This is a pretty big aspect of the game that I haven't touched on yet. All 4 characters are running around at once, so unless you have some friends on standby, you're going to be accompanied by 3 of the laziest AI characters ever. When you first start playing, you'd be forgiven for thinking the AI characters just don't do anything other than follow you, kind of like the GBA game. In reality, they do help out with combat, but they do the bare minimum. They'll fire off a couple of shots here and there, but most of the time it feels like they're just standing around, and they're certainly not going to use any of their special abilities. Their lack of help becomes really evident in all of the boss battles. You'll deactivate the shield or whatever and go in for the kill, only for your teammates to stand around and be absolutely no help, or at best they'll fire off 1 or 2 shots. It's just insulting. Why even bother to have all of the characters on screen at once if they're not going to do anything? It's a big ask playing this game almost 20 years after release, but play with a friend or 2 if you can. The experience is going to be significantly improved if you do. The gameplay isn't awful, but it's definitely not the draw card here. I give them props for doing something unique with it, but there are too many flaws. If this wasn't a Nicktoons crossover game, I'd be far more negative. But it shines in just enough areas that I have hope for the future of this series. Blue Tongue was allowed to return and develop Battle for Volcano Island and Attack of the Toybots before being replaced for Globs of Doom. I really hope that continuity means they can hone and fine-tune the formula. When looked at in the context of being the first game in a trilogy from Blue Tongue, I'm hopeful for the direction of this series. For me, Nicktoons Unite's home console version is a little too flawed to end up in the highest tiers, so that means I'm going to rank it as a B. It's a great start for the series and I thoroughly enjoyed my time with it, And when you think that there are still 3 more games to come, I'm pretty keen to find out how much more they can improve on the formula that was developed here. So yeah, as expected, the DS version kicks off with the same story as the GBA game, and you basically get the same opening cinematic. It's actually impressive how poor this looks. All the different art styles being brought together here and just sort of mushed up is so distracting. But when you jump out of that inconsequential cutscene, the game looks pretty damn nice for a 3D game on the DS. Characters look solid and the environments are impressive in terms of size and their appearance. Maybe it's because I just didn't see a whole lot of 3D DS games when I was growing up, but I'm always impressed when I see something like this running on a DS. As you can tell, we've got a 3D platformer here that is pretty similar to the GBA version with emphasis on the combat and puzzle solving, but with a way bigger emphasis on actual platforming too. With the addition of the touchscreen and some extra face buttons, Climax was able to get a little deeper with the mechanics in this one. A is the attack button and X is your jump. Climax surprisingly built a lot of this game around the characters having unique traversal options. Characters always have something special happen when you double tap X, rather than just handing out a generic double jump. Jimmy gets a little jetpack boost, which is essentially a double jump, but SpongeBob will glide and Danny can wall jump. It's things like this that make Nicktoons Unite on DS kind of endearing. Like, Timmy actually doesn't get an attack here. Instead, pressing the attack button makes him hide in a shrub, so he's mainly used for stealth. The dedicated Timmy sneaking levels are pretty crap, but even so, I like that Climax didn't just slap everybody with the same abilities and call it a day. This level of experimentation leads to some weird control quirks, like Y making you walk slowly. Having beaten the game, I've still got no idea why anybody would use this, but hey, it's here. Breaking out your stylus gives you access to a couple more things, the first of which is character selection. Here you'll be controlling a single character at a time, but whenever you want to, you can drag a different character to the center of the touchscreen and you instantly change. I really do mean instantly too. Swapping characters is so seamless and it goes a long way to making the gameplay feel smooth. A version of this game where switching characters holds everything up for a second or two would be significantly worse. Each character also gets their own health bar, so don't expect to be failing levels too often. The other common use of the touchscreen is to activate your special moves, but rather than being a collection of super mega ultra attacks, these specials are all focused on traversal in one way or another. SpongeBob can float upwards in a bubble, Danny will phase through certain walls, Jimmy gets an extended use of the jetpack, and then Timmy gets a sprint. As a side note, you do actually get a super mega ultra attack that is activated via the touchscreen, but the power-ups to activate these are uncommon, and they honestly aren't that cool. I really prefer the way you utilize each character's powers in this version. The different abilities mesh well, and the different types of traversal lead to some fun level design. But one of the big issues with Nicktoons Unite is that character balance is way off. I spent the majority of the game using Jimmy and Danny because their attacks and abilities were by far the most useful. Poor Timmy, on the other hand, was almost never used except for when his sprint or stealth abilities were explicitly required, which was almost never. Just like the GBA version, beating levels will require you to collect certain amounts of items, and you'll also have to destroy portals. This time, levels are a pretty linear experience, so you can't really miss any of the items unless you're doing some sort of insane challenge run where you're playing the game blindfolded. The whole gameplay experience is very much like Tak the Great Juju Challenge on DS. This feels like a PS1 game that somehow happened to stumble out in 2005. And those PS1 sensibilities are never felt more strongly than when you're fighting the camera for control. Climax gives you the option to center the camera behind you at any time by pressing B, which works perfectly. The big issue is that Climax also starts auto-adjusting the camera for you. It's not even helpful in the slightest the majority of the time. If camera control had just been left up to the player to press B and get the camera back behind you, I honestly think it would have been fine. And a fair warning to anybody attempting to play this game after watching this video, the tutorial level is arguably the worst in the game. It feels like none of the mechanics mesh well here, and I'd say the way Climax teaches the player how to use the tools at their disposal is very poor. To me, it felt like the game got significantly better once I left this level. The rest of the game is a decent mixture of combat, platforming, and traversal puzzle solving. A lot of the game does feel very copy-paste though. Levels tend to follow a very strict structure to the point where it feels like you're just repeating the same levels with a different skin. And we've got to talk about the genuine puzzle sections too. It's basically tradition for licensed games on the DS to just go balls to the wall and dump a million different touchscreen gimmick ideas in to make the player miserable. Tak the Great Juju Challenge was notorious for this. The most commonly occurring minigame here is the hacking puzzle, where you're supposed to match up the same shapes or something. Never once did I feel like I fully understood this one. Tapping on the same shapes would work sometimes, other times it just wouldn't. Most times I'd just fall ass backwards through these sections. At sporadic points, the game will stop and force a minigame onto you, oftentimes replacing actual fights with the villains here. You've got flicking, tapping, and circling like you're playing Pokemon Ranger to absolutely bore you to tears. And if you're a real masochist, there's an arcade machine in the hub area where you can replay these minigames for fun. Don't think the boss battles come out of this review unscathed either. Special shout out to the Vlad Plasmus boss battle. It's one of those pretty standard fights where the boss spawns a bunch of clones and you have to identify the real one to actually deal damage. Generally, the rule is that the OG boss has some sort of giveaway so you know it's them. Instead, Nicktoons Unite has none of that, so you just fire around blindly. And then the Plankton boss battle is next level tedious. The awkward combo of Timmy and SpongeBob's traversal powers combined with how long it takes to chip away at Plankton's health honestly had me considering whether I wanted to keep playing. But one thing always kept me going here no matter how bad things got: the soundtrack. The music is credited to Matthew Simmons, who has had a long career stretching back to 1990, but I can't really find many notable games in his work history other than Silent Hill Shattered Memories. He also didn't return for any of the sequels, as Japanese developer Natsume took control of the following 3 DS games. But seriously, from top to bottom, the songs in this game are so damn good. One of my favourites was this track from the Vlad's Castle level. I got some major Animal Crossing vibes from this SpongeBob one too. The soundtrack is the one area where Nicktoons Unite is faultless. The rest of the game is a bit of a flawed gem. I really do love the way it brings together the different abilities of each character, but there are just so many issues here that drag it down. It's glaringly obvious that it was made on a budget and under massive time pressure, which leads to big portions of the game feeling like it was copy and pasted. I wouldn't say to stay away from this one if you're a big Nick fan, because there's a lot of stuff to enjoy, but just go in with massively adjusted expectations. There are some genuinely great parts of Nicktoons Unite on the DS, and I'd almost go as far as calling it a flawed gem, but those flaws I mentioned drag it down enough that I can only fit it into C tier. The narrative set up to bring together 4 separate Nick shows dives into the multiverse thanks to Jimmy Neutron's genius inventions. Basically, he creates portals to other dimensions, which Professor Calamitous takes advantage of to recruit Vlad Plasmus, Crocker, and Plankton to form the Syndicate of Evil. And their first plan of action is to create a f***ing doomsday device to end the entire world. This is just a tad extreme, and thankfully Jimmy agrees too. So he goes out and he recruits his own super team like we're watching the 2016 NBA Finals. I'm going to assume that this is the story for both other versions, but I imagine the DS and especially the home console version goes much more in depth on the story stuff. Outside of the opening, it's basically all gameplay here in the GBA version. Before even touching on anything else, I've got to talk about the graphics. You get smacked in the face with this as soon as you enter the first level. Climax Studios made the bizarre choice to use pre-rendered sprites for all of the playable characters, and some select enemies too, while everything else is 2D. It creates such a visual clash to the point where it makes you feel like two separate games have been merged into one. I don't think they meant it on purpose, but that kind of feeling does fit with a game dealing with multiverse shenanigans. Maybe this design choice could have worked if the characters only looked like this when outside of their own universe, but even that's a stretch. The characters look awful, and you're probably asking yourself why Climax chose this sort of art style. The answer is cutting costs and saving time. Apparently, according to the cutting room floor, these are taken from the DS version, which is why they look so different from everything else in the game. Climax decided to save a bunch of time and money by just creating one set of characters. Smart, but also makes this game significantly worse than it would be if they just created sprites specifically for this game. I've got no doubt they were under insane time crunch, especially because they were developing the DS version simultaneously, so I won't crucify them too much, but yeah, this game ain't pretty. Thankfully, the gameplay in Nicktoons Unite GBA is serviceable. What we've got is a 2D combat puzzle platformer. The actual platforming here is mostly an afterthought. All the emphasis is put on the combat and puzzles, which is why you end up with a vertical leap that would put NBA players to shame. Also, you come across multiple gaps that you need to jump through, but the window is so tight that you'll be retrying it over and over again until the game just finally lets you through. It becomes pretty obvious that platforming really wasn't Climax's priority. At the beginning of each level, you're asked to pick two characters to play as. You control one of these at a time, with your AI companion following along in a surprisingly competent manner. However, they will stop following you at times, largely when you activate one of the game's special traversal moves. This results in some very light Lost Vikings-esque gameplay, but it's not like Ed, Edd and Eddy Jawbreakers, where you're completing large stretches of levels multiple times with different characters. The forced separation always ends quickly, and you simply walk past the AI character to get them to rejoin you. But it doesn't always work that well in practice. Getting the characters to rejoin you is super janky, and for something that is so basic, you'll spend way too much time fiddling with it. The goal of each level is to destroy 3 interdimensional portals, and then collect 4 nanochips, which will unlock an end of level portal. Controls are kept pretty simple. A jumps, B attacks, L switches to your secondary character, and then R activates your character's special traversal move. Most characters shoot a projectile as their standard attack, but they each have enough difference so it doesn't feel like they're all the same character. Danny has the strongest in terms of power, Jimmy's will freeze enemies in place, while SpongeBob has the weakest attack. Timmy, on the other hand, gets an entirely different attack. It's a sort of magical explosion that is only effective at really close range. It can be tricky to line this one up, but when you do, it absolutely shreds enemies. The special traversal moves are really where most of the gameplay lies though. Levels are entirely built around using specific traversal powers to get into hard to reach areas. It's an absolute requirement to use certain characters for certain puzzles, which means Climax gives you the ability to change characters during levels. These teleporters are scattered throughout, generally popping up exactly when you need them. The traversal abilities are limited, so you can't just use them non-stop, forcing you to collect these character-specific power-ups to refill your meter. The meter does automatically refill to the halfway point at all times though, so the power-ups aren't always necessary. Instead, they basically act as a cue for realizing it's time to change characters. When you see the Danny power-ups change into SpongeBob power-ups, there's your solution to the next puzzle. So anytime you see a transporter or a change in power-ups, you're going to be switching characters, and this really eliminates a lot of the puzzle solving. Jimmy and Timmy share the exact same power of being able to jetpack up into high spots, or in Timmy's case, you balloon up into the high spots. Danny can go invisible to sneak past certain walls, and SpongeBob will squeeze into tight spaces. The entire game is about you entering a level, fighting off the occasional enemy, selecting the right character to get to a transporter or nano chip, or just to move forward in the level, and then you repeat that for a couple of hours. It's a decent at best experience. Some of the level design does get pretty clever, and the puzzle solving can be fun when Climax doesn't completely telegraph which character is required next. But it's nothing special, and it also has its sore spots. You've got those typical frustrating moments in games like this where you get to the end of a level and then you realize you've missed one of the required items. Backtracking and scouring every inch of a level for a nano chip is just never going to be fun. There's also no difficulty to speak of here. Sure, you will die at points, but there's no repercussions at all. Combine it with every puzzle solution being spoon-fed to you, and you pretty much end up sleepwalking through Nicktoons Unite. The game is split up into 3 levels for each show. The first 2 are your standard gameplay that I've described, while the last level isn't really a level, it's just basically a boss battle against the corresponding show's villain. Again, these are insanely easy. But on a more positive note, the music is pretty good here, and I particularly like this Fairly Odd Parents inspired tune. The fate of Nicktoons Unite on the GBA is much like the DS version. Some good ideas packed in here, but flaws keep holding it back. It's going to join its dual screen sibling in C tier. Nicktoons Unite laid a solid foundation for a franchise to really grow from. The game had a distinct gameplay style, choosing to use a similar formula to the X-Men Legends games, and the initial roster of characters for this crossover, while limited, made sense. SpongeBob, Jimmy Neutron, Fairly Odd Parents, and Danny Phantom were the only shows featured, with those 4 shows being the main priorities for Nickelodeon at the time. We got 4 bosses taken from those 4 shows, and then a bunch of side characters showing up throughout the story. It wasn't the most mind-blowing, over-the-top crossover event ever put together, but it was a good start. Going into Battle for Volcano Island, I expected Blue Tongue to take things to the next level. Instead, they somehow took a step back. The same 4 shows are represented here, but we've actually lost a playable character. Jimmy only appears in cutscenes and doesn't even show up in the flesh, instead just giving exposition via a screen. And I'd even argue that we lost another one of the main characters from Nicktoons Unite, because for some reason, Timmy is playable in just 1 level. The playable character roster did expand, but instead of adding new shows, we got side characters like Patrick, Sam, and Sandy. You also get cameo appearances from Tucker and Squidward. Overall, the crossover portion of this game is an objective step backwards. This seems like a baffling decision. You'd imagine Blue Tongue would ramp this right up after setting the foundations in the first game, but instead the opposite happened. It makes me feel that either the budgets or timelines were very tight for this sequel. They had almost exactly 1 year to make Battle for Volcano Island, and in that time they revamped the gameplay, which I'll touch on in a second, so they might have just run out of time to include more characters in the game. Another thing that seems to be in favor of this theory is that concept art shows both Jenny and Jimmy on Volcano Island. So at one point these 2 characters were at the very least planned to show up, and I'd be very surprised if the intention wasn't to have them playable. Despite some potentially very valid reasons for the lackluster roster and crossover here, it's still exactly that, lackluster. My dream is for the Nicktoons Unite games to be a celebration of the deep history Nickelodeon had developed at this point. I want to see Angelica kicking the shit out of some birds. What makes this even more disappointing is that you can see some attempts from Blue Tongue to pepper in some continuity and references. Plankton's robots from the first game can be seen in the first level, and Invader Zim gets referenced twice in this game, showing off both Zim's spaceship and house at points. The story also has its issues. I'm not expecting an absolute epic tale to be told here, but I felt let down by Battle for Volcano Island. Unite went for the classic crossover trope of having all of the villains from different franchises team up, but here Blue Tongue goes for an original villain. From the opening cutscene you get introduced to Morgu. It's very ominous and makes Morgu seem like a super scary threat. The heroes then get summoned to Volcano Island, but most of them are separated, leaving just Danny and SpongeBob together, who meet this sus old crab who explains Morgu escaped from a prison and has created an ooze that is corrupting whatever it touches. It's a neat initial setup that never really develops much beyond that opening cutscene. I feel like the bare-bones story combined with an original villain just compounds the issues. If we had a bare-bones story featuring villains we already know, we can kind of fill in the backstory as we're familiar with these characters and we know their motivations. But with Morgu, I've got no idea who this guy is, and other than a few minor story beats with his minions causing trouble, you don't really get to find out too much about what's going on. Heck, you only run into him at the very end of the game. I know it's not exactly scientific evidence, but if you want a comparison of how different the stories are between the first and second games, check out how long the plot summaries are on the Nickelodeon wiki. Outside of the opening cutscene where Jimmy exposition dumps, and the finale, Battle for Volcano Island doesn't have much narrative. It seems especially bad compared to Nicktoons Unite, which seems like a damn novel when you read the plot summary. And while the crossover and story stuff in Battle for Volcano Island is lacking, the voice acting definitely isn't. All of the voice actors return here, they put in performances that wouldn't be out of place in their shows, and I think all of the interactions between the characters are great.
Okay, we split into 3 teams. Sandy, Sam, Timmy, and Patrick, you go that way and wait for the Magu to get close. Tucker, you stay here at the switch. Squidward, SpongeBob, you're with me.
Me?
Yes, you, Squidward. I have a plan.
Well, that's a cover.
These moments are the best part of crossovers, and it's a double-edged sword here. I love the interactions, but it just makes me long for a Nicktoons game that pays homage to all the Nicktoons that built Nickelodeon, not just the ones that were currently airing when this game was made. So the crossover and story aren't exactly incredible here, and while those are important aspects of a game like this, even if they're amazing, they're a bit pointless if the gameplay sucks. Well, right off the bat, I can say the gameplay does not suck, but to my shock, Blue Tongue tweaked the gameplay a lot more than I was expecting. Like I mentioned earlier, Unite's X-Men Legends style gameplay has been replaced with a more stock standard beat 'em up formula. The RPG elements have been stripped out, and now you're pretty much exclusively brawling your way through levels. Characters all play pretty similar. Everybody has a melee attack and then a projectile attack, which you have to collect orange orbs to power up. Well, Patrick actually doesn't have a projectile attack. He does an absolutely out of control cartwheel, but everybody else has a projectile. Sam also gets access to the peeler suit that lasts for a limited time, but has unlimited ammo in that time, so it pretty much just melts enemies. Anytime you see this pickup, you need to switch to Sam because it's so OP. But other than those few differences between select characters, pretty much all of the Nicktoons play exactly the same, a stark difference to Unite. In fact, there really isn't a real reason to switch between characters here other than personal preference. In my experience, the damage output is essentially the same for every character, and there weren't certain attacks that were required to be used against certain enemies. And it's this sameness that makes it confusing why Timmy is playable in just one level. The game chooses which characters are available for each level, but it's not like there are puzzles requiring certain abilities or whatever. In a world where somebody modded this game, there wouldn't be any reason why you couldn't go through every level with the character of your choosing. I think allowing players to choose who they take into a level would have been a lot cooler. It also makes it a bit more confusing that they didn't just make Squidward and Tucker playable as well. All of the characters essentially have the exact same powers, so I don't know how hard it would have been to add them in. It's not like the devs would have needed to create brand new character archetypes. As you're running around levels, you'll face plenty of Morgu's minions, but also you'll be committing a lot of bird murder too. These birds don't seem to be related to Morgu in any way, they're just out to kill you for some reason. In your never-ending war against the birds, you will have to stoop to some pretty disturbing lows, like crushing a nest of eggs. Kinda makes Morgu not seem so bad in comparison to what we're doing. While I do think some of the gameplay is maybe a bit of a step back from Unite, it's definitely not bad. I had an enjoyable time brawling through all of the game's levels. One of the big step-ups is that Battle for Volcano Island feels a lot more fluid in its movement and combat. This really shines in the game's bonus levels, which are basically platforming speedrun challenges. Without the tight movement controls, these would be a nightmare, but to my pleasant surprise, I found it to be great. It's not perfect, but it's basically as perfect as I could realistically expect from a Nicktoons game. And for some reason, the devs gave you a sneaking ability. At no point in this game do you ever need to sneak around, but they went through the effort of providing each character with a unique sneaking animation. I don't know if this was a victim of cut content and the game was supposed to have some sort of stealth element, or maybe this was the work of a bored dev, but I appreciate getting to see SpongeBob prancing. I don't think this matters too much, as I found the game pretty easy to breeze through, but the teammate AI has not improved here at all. This was a big pet peeve of mine in Unite, as it really didn't feel like you were in a team. The exact same thing happens here, and I'd almost argue that the AI is worse. Not only will characters not attack enemies most of the time, but they straight up will not follow you or attempt to do any traversal a lot of the time. There were so many times where they just abandoned me. Usually they'll teleport to you after a brief moment, but there are also times where you just run around for extended periods all by yourself. Like I said, it doesn't actually affect the gameplay, but it still kinda sucks.
Jesus Christ.
Speaking of the game being kinda easy, we've gotta talk about the boss battles.
Oh, here we go. It's that long plethora of, oh my God.
Wait for it.
I will. Let me get a chair.
Yes, nothing has changed in my long hiatus. I'm still on my bullshit hating on boss battles. The issue with Battle for Volcano Islands is that they're just a bit dull and laughably easy. You'll figure out what you need to do in seconds and then just spam it until the boss goes down in a flash. This even applies to the Morgu fight, which really doesn't help with the overall feeling that the story is a bit non-existent. The levels themselves are fun to explore though. Levels have plenty of branching paths with collectibles to find, which give them extra life instead of just being a linear path. The collectibles felt worthwhile too. Each character has two sets of collectibles that specifically relate to them. First up are essentially coins, but they're themed to each character, so you're grabbing stuff like pearls for SpongeBob. These unlock special costumes for each character, which are references to moments from their shows. This is an aspect where the game definitely shines in terms of embracing Nickelodeon history. During the main game, I only unlocked the special costume for Danny, but throughout the course of the final level, I unlocked Sam and Timmy's. This definitely gives the game a bit of replayability, and the same goes for unlocking the bonus levels. Each character has 4 salvage items that are scattered throughout the game. These items are very bizarre, especially Danny's. I'm not sure why Blue Tongue thought he had an obsession with tiki statues. Nobody in my live chat while I was streaming the game could figure out why this was included, so if you do know, leave a comment below. As mentioned, collecting all of these unlocks bonus levels that are essentially speedrun stages. You'll also collect items for the NPC characters, and these unlock a cutscene viewer and art gallery in the hub world. Speaking of the hub world, yeah, that exists. There was kind of a neat idea here. Things get added to this area as you unlock bonus levels, and it also acts as a level selector to replay certain levels. Only problem is, during the main story, the game sort of just teleports you to where you need to be in the hub world most of the time, and you can also immediately select bonus levels from a menu rather than trying to find them on the island. I give them credit for trying something here, but they give the player too many quality of life inclusions to actually warrant exploring the hub. I've mentioned a lot of negatives here, but I hope I'm not making it seem like I didn't enjoy my time with Battle for Volcano Island. I think this is a good game, and honestly a fair bit more enjoyable than Unite. It's because of the game's positives and potential that I'm so harsh on the aspects where it lets itself down. Even if they just beefed up the crossover elements and gave the story a bit more love, I think Battle for Volcano Island would have been a truly great experience. Instead, it more accurately falls into the good category. In fact, I like Battle for Volcano Island so much more than Unite that it's enough to bump it up a whole tier into A. Battle for Volcano Island is a worthy first induction into the A tier, but will its handheld counterparts be able to reach the same heights? While the home console version got to keep their developer for the follow-up to Nicktoons Unite, both the DS and GBA versions would replace their developers entirely. Climax were in charge of both handheld versions of Unite, but they've been kicked out for Japanese developer Natsume, and they'd go on to develop every DS release for the rest of the Unite series. Because of this developer switch, Battle for Volcano Island is basically only a sequel in terms of story. The gameplay is radically different. The first thing you'll notice is that we've lost a dimension here. Unite was an ambitious 3D platformer, while Natsume have scaled things back and opted for a 2D platformer that utilizes both screens of the DS. First impressions of Battle for Volcano Island are very strong. We kick things off with a neat little cutscene, and I was pretty shocked when I was greeted by some voice acting.
Hey, this doesn't look like Bikini Bottom.
It's used sparingly, but it's still a great addition. Then you jump into the game and the positives keep coming. The game looks beautiful, and I loved how vibrant everything looked here. And on top of that, you have what is arguably this game's greatest strength, which is the soundtrack. Maybe I'm a bit biased because the opening cutscene sounds like it's been ripped from a Pokemon game, but the entire OST is filled top to bottom with incredible tracks, to the point where I'd go as far as saying it's the best in Nickelodeon history. So it's a pretty positive start for Battle for Volcano Island on the DS, but these presentation aspects are probably the only areas where the game isn't flawed, at least a little. The first letdown I noticed was the story. Now, I've played enough licensed games and handheld adaptations of home console games to know that story is always a casualty in these versions. You just inevitably need to pare back the story because of hardware limitations, budget, or hitting your deadlines. But the story here is just so bare bones. SpongeBob, Timmy, and Danny all just sort of randomly show up to this beach, and this wise old hermit crab explains that you need to save Volcano Island from being destroyed by Morgoo. Apparently Morgoo is absorbing energy from the universe to grow stronger or something. It feels very half-baked in this version, and you don't really ever get a feeling for who or what Morgoo is, which I guess is pretty similar to the home console version. You do get some more story stuff along the way, and Jimmy shows up to do his exposition dump, but there really isn't much of a narrative here. After your opening cutscene, you get to jump straight into the gameplay, but I'd recommend checking out the game's optional tutorial before doing this. If you jump straight into the gameplay, you're going to be incredibly lost. Actually controlling the characters is pretty basic. You're able to switch through the 3 characters on the fly, and they all have their own unique benefits to tackle levels. SpongeBob's got a bubble blow attack and can glide, Danny has a punch and kick combo that is by far the fastest and strongest method of attacking, and lastly, Timmy has a vacuum cleaner attack and is the best option for platforming as he has a double jump. All of these abilities will be naturally discovered by players, but the real issue is you'll have no idea how to progress without sitting through the tutorial, which is completely hands-off by the way, you just sit there and watch a video. Very quickly, you'll come to this portal that requires 3 crystals. The only issue is the game doesn't tell you how to find these outside of the tutorial. This is done by tapping on these dog-plant hybrid looking things on the bottom screen. A bunch of these are scattered around levels, so you'll have to tap on basically each and every one of these unless you're following a guide. One of the annoying things about this system is that you need to be on the bottom screen to actually tap them. As mentioned briefly, the developers opted for using both screens, giving levels a lot of verticality as you transition from top to bottom and vice versa. This is cool in theory, but doesn't really work for me. The main issue is that the way the screen cuts off between top and bottom is very awkward, and it can be super disorienting when trying to make a jump that requires you to go from one screen to the other. It really hurts the flow of the platforming, and it resulted in plenty of frustrating moments. Then you have more minor annoyances, like the issue I was alluding to with trying to tap the dog-plant hybrids. You need to be on the bottom screen for you to search for a crystal, which leads to tedious moments where you can see them above you but have to climb your way up to tap them. Once you figure out what you're supposed to do in this game, or just watch the tutorials so you don't bumble around like an idiot the way I did, the game sets into its rhythm. Each world is broken into 3 sections. The crystal collecting sections are referred to as the field area, where the goal is always to collect 3 crystals and take them to a gate. Next up, you have the action area, which has a greater focus on combat and precision platforming, with the goal purely being to make it to the end without dying. Then you round it off with a boss battle, which is pretty self-explanatory. You also get this fruit-catching minigame to play after Worlds, which was just kind of a weird addition and not very fun to play. I was hoping you'd maybe get a bunch of different minigames to play, but they really stuck with this for the entire way through. You repeat this cycle for 5 worlds total, which will probably end up taking you like 2 hours to complete. Overall, the game controls decently. It's not the smoothest platforming ever, but I had no major gripes with it, and the same goes for Danny's combat. It's not the most fluid, but it gets the job done for the kind of combat on display here. In fact, I'd argue Danny gets the job done a little too well. He's by far the strongest and best combat option for the majority of the game's enemies, so there's no real need to use other characters in these scenarios. Likewise, Timmy having the double jump makes him the only real option for platforming. So basically, you use Timmy for platforming, Danny for combat, and SpongeBob only if the game absolutely 100% requires you to use him. It's a bit of a shame. SpongeBob ends up feeling pretty useless here. The devs really didn't give him an ability that enticed me to use him. I guess one of the ways they force you to use different characters is via all these pickups that are scattered around levels. You've got these purple coins which anybody can pick up, and they're just for completion, not necessarily a requirement or a power-up. You'll quickly come across things like underwear or sunglasses, which are this game's health items. But in an annoying quirk, you need to be controlling the specific character who corresponds with this health item when picking it up for it to take effect. So basically, you accidentally end up wasting a bunch of health items. This also means each character has an individual set of health, which was fine, but did feel a bit weird when losing all your health with one character would force you to restart. This is clearly done because you need certain characters' abilities to progress in levels, but it would have made more sense to me if it was just one shared health bar. This setup actually makes the end of level boss battles pretty easy when you can just tank a bunch of hits and then switch out to a fresh character. Outside of the health, there were also temporary power-ups you could find and activate with X. I honestly didn't use these a whole lot because the game didn't require it. I did play on normal difficulty though, so maybe this ends up playing a greater role on hard. The gameplay also has a few other minor frustrations. Trying to grab onto these swinging vines in the second level completely sucks ass and had me minutes away from sending my controller through a wall. There's this overly long animation that plays whenever you land from a significant height, which doesn't serve any purpose other than to be annoying. You don't even take fall damage here, so why did they include this? And then the way the camera is focused, you often have to blindly jump over pits. There is a camera movement control, but this is cumbersome to use, and whipping it out every time you need to make a jump brings the gameplay to a standstill, which kinda ruins the flow of everything. But overall, I'd say the gameplay is passable, which coupled with solid presentation means Battle for Volcano Island on the DS is hitting a pass mark right now. Where things really fall down is the crossover department. As with the home console version, this is less a Nicktoons crossover and more a SpongeBob, Fairly OddParents, and Danny Phantom crossover. Jimmy makes an appearance here, but is entirely non-playable like in the home console version, and mostly exists to dump exposition and provide some gadgets that push along the story, but never appear in the gameplay. Both Patrick and Tucker get brief cameos, but again, they're not playable unlike in other versions. Battle for Volcano Island on DS is definitely the biggest letdown when it comes to packing in characters. it manages to get outshined by its GBA version, who at least has Patrick as a playable character. But it's hard to fault the devs for this too much here, as this absolutely is a symptom of the flagship home console version being poor in the crossover department. This definitely isn't a bad game, and I'd recommend Nickelodeon fans checking it out. Just don't expect a life-changing crossover to be happening here. I found Battle for Volcano Island on DS to be a tough one to rank. In many ways, it's a fun game, but it falls down in just too many areas and has the awful story and crossover elements taken from the home console version applied here, so I think I need to put it in B tier. God help anybody who only played this version of Battle for Volcano Island and tried to understand the game's story. A common theme throughout all versions of Battle for Volcano Island is that the story is very light and it really needed to be fleshed out. Well, that's at its absolute worst here in the GBA version. You genuinely cannot understand the story if you only play this version. I know this because I played this version first and I was so lost. The game might as well have not even had a story. Basically, the game kicks off with Timmy just being randomly dropped into a jungle. SpongeBob then gets dumped onto a beach, Cosmo and Wanda show up and they say that Timmy needs help, and SpongeBob just runs off aimlessly. He then stumbles upon Danny, and eventually you get a little bit of backstory from the wise crab. And by backstory, you basically find out that Morgoo is bad and tainted purple ooze is spreading across the island. SpongeBob and Danny decide they should contact Jimmy, and you're then dropped into the game's overworld. Once Jimmy is contacted, he just sort of knows about Morgoo for some reason, and that's pretty much the extent of the story. Jimmy gets you to collect pieces of the Rip Zipper, which is done by completing levels, but that's it. Obviously, you eventually face Morgoo, and while he looks cool and all, you really get no understanding of what's going on, why anything is happening, or what the hell Morgoo even is. Not that the other versions are much better at this, but the GBA version is definitely the worst at it. The crossover aspect of the GBA version is the next thing we need to discuss. Somehow, this manages to be slightly better than the DS version, but not by much. Playable characters are SpongeBob, Danny, Timmy, and Patrick. The fact that Patrick is playable makes it slightly better than the DS game, but only barely because it's just another SpongeBob rep, rather than a character from a new show. Again, Jimmy is unplayable, and you don't really get any cameos from other NPCs. Because of the story focusing on Morgoo, no iconic villains are present yet again. Like the home console version, characters are drip-fed to you as you progress. You have SpongeBob and Danny after the tutorial, then once you progress to the game's second world, you'll find Timmy. You'll play through this jungle area and then the cave world as just the 3 characters, before unlocking the game's final character in the Wild West themed 4th world. Patrick shows up and he's pantsless. The 5th world is beach themed, and it's around this time the game will basically try and force you to face Morgoo. You see, the game has you collecting parts to build the Rip Zipper, with certain numbers of parts being required to unlock new areas of the game, but once you hit 18, the game basically throws you into a cutscene and thrusts you towards the end game. It's very abrupt, and when combined with the fact that the story is bare bones and then the actual final level is over super quick, fighting Morgoo just doesn't feel like a big deal. It really lacks the gravity you'd expect from a final fight. But enough complaining about the story and crossover aspects. Let's dig into the gameplay. The first thing you need to know about Battle for Volcano Island on GBA is that you shouldn't expect to be fighting enemies. You'll drop in and expect the character's special abilities to do damage, or failing that, maybe you can jump on their heads. But all that does is see you take damage. Confusingly, in the tutorial stage, you actually don't lose health. In fact, the game doesn't even display health, which was very confusing. Until you jump into a proper level, and then all of a sudden you do have health. Here, losing a heart of health takes you back to a checkpoint, but confusingly, this only happens when you land on an environmental hazard. If you get hit by an enemy, you just continue on while still losing some health. Hitting the left bumper will switch between characters, which you'll be doing frequently as each character gains a couple of special abilities that are all tied to traversing levels. Naturally, Danny can go invisible, which allows him to walk through walls and also allows him to see ghost platforms that aren't visible outside of this state. SpongeBob blows bubbles that can activate switches, and then he eventually gains the ability to dig through dirt. Timmy has the power to slingshot himself off these rings, and in the very final world he gains the ability to smash through stuff. And then Patrick uses his enormous girth to cling to surfaces and activate switches. Once he regains his pants, he can also use them as a parachute when being shot out of a cannon. All of these abilities work really well, except for the parachute ability with Patrick. Well, the parachuting itself isn't too bad, but the way the devs use it makes it such a pain in the ass. There's this insanely finicky section where you have to parachute into a wall cling, and it's just terrible. The controls of the parachuting ability just aren't made for doing such a precision task, and passing this one obstacle had me tearing my hair out. They included a few more sections like this in this world, and it's absolutely the worst part of the game. Prior to this, I really had no major gameplay issues, but these sections were so bad it started souring me on the whole experience. Outside of that, the movement controls pretty well. Platforming works decently, and all of the movement feels really crisp. Still not too sure why Patrick humps the air when he jumps though. As you go through these levels, you'll find yellow hearts to collect. It's not entirely obvious what these do at first, except that they actually provide some of the game's challenge. Just grabbing a yellow heart isn't good enough to actually collect it. You then need to not take any damage for the rest of the level. Take a hit, well, there goes the heart. You'll find multiple of these scattered through levels, always a little bit off the direct path, and these hearts stack so you don't have to worry about completing entire levels with 0 damage taken to at least get some yellow hearts. As you go around the overworld, you'll see that there are sections gated off by a yellow heart requirement. These aren't required for the game's main objective, and thank God, because these have some absolutely absurd requirements. I didn't try to collect all of these, and for good reason. Just check out this Reddit comment that sums up what a colossal waste of time these yellow hearts are. Individual levels are short and sweet, never overstaying their welcome. I found that this had a nice flow to it, especially when you were going through levels that asked you to constantly switch to different characters' abilities to tackle obstacles. It feels like everything is put together logically, and you get into a sort of flow state where everything just feels right. Levels do get a bit more difficult towards the end, ignoring the parachute bullshit, and this provides a decent sense of challenge that most players will find lacking in the earlier levels. Visually, I thought Battle for Volcano Island looked solid on the GBA. Feels quite similar to a lot of other Nick games I've seen, but I guess at this point in the GBA's life cycle, and with how many Nick games have appeared on the console, we've kinda seen and done everything the GBA is capable of. What I really enjoyed was the music. The music in the first world is pretty meh, but everything after that takes a serious step up. I was really digging the music from the cave world. Tell me you couldn't imagine this being used in an Adventure Time game. Overall, Battle for Volcano Island on GBA is another solid effort. It carries a lot of the negatives from the other versions as they really fall down in the story and crossover areas. It's hard to fault Halfbrick, the developers of this version, as they're kind of forced to do whatever the flagship version is doing. But when you look at the aspects they were responsible for, we've actually got a pretty good game here. I loathe the parachute sections, and having absolutely no combat present is a little strange, especially when you have Danny Phantom in the game, but those are minor gripes in what was a fun experience. Definitely worth checking out. Having said all that, I think it's pretty easy for me to rank Battle for Volcano Island on GBA. I'm gonna put it into B tier. It does pretty much everything really well, but unfortunately the flagship version having a bit of an awkward story and crossover situation kind of affects the ranking of this game too. But Nick fans definitely shouldn't let that deter them from playing this game. It's a really fun experience. Dude, they've got tack in this one. How could it possibly be a bad game? Attack of the Toybots makes a great first impression. You boot up the game, and immediately you get a cutscene featuring Professor Calamitous. This was something that I just mentioned about Battle for Volcano Island that I thought was really lacking, those iconic villains. Calamitous is here explaining his evil plan, and there's some sort of weird game show going on here. It doesn't really make too much sense and it's never really explained. Hell, Calamitus's plan never really makes a whole lot of sense. Just a bunch of weird nonsense about fairies farting too much if they eat Krabby Patties, and there's some ghost energy nonsense. For some reason, Morgoo shows up in the cutscene too. Once you actually start the game, you then get a cutscene of SpongeBob and Patrick delivering a leaning tower of Krabby Patties. These are stolen by a robot, and Patrick inadvertently gets sucked up into the evil Toyco factory, which then kicks off the whole game. I would say that the story as a whole is better here than in Volcano Island, but it's not without its own flaws. Yes, each time you get a cutscene, they're high quality and have a solid length to them, but it just feels like the story is lacking some sort of spark. There aren't any interesting twists and turns, except Chadbot turning on Calamitus, but this lacks any meaning because the face turn happens the first time you meet Chadbot.
Who are you people?
It's better, but the story still suffers from being mostly non-existent and unimportant like Volcano Island. Like the game show element I mentioned before, this is never really explained, it's just kinda there. It almost feels like I've been dropped into a story that's already 25% of the way through and I've missed out on crucial info. I also found that the cutscenes don't really give any serious moments of interaction between the different characters, something that Unite nailed. Most cutscenes in Attack of the Toybots amount to Calamitus spouting evil threats, and then the characters reacting. Kinda defeats the purpose of a crossover when the crossover characters aren't doing much with each other. I think the story is the aspect that Blue Tongue has let me down with most in their trilogy. They started off really strong in Unite. That game had 30 minutes of cutscenes, and it felt like we were getting cool moments between the characters. Volcano Island had around 15 minutes of cutscenes, with a story that barely existed. And while Toybots bumps the cutscenes up to just over 20 minutes, it suffers from a lot of the same issues as its predecessor. Some concept art shows a scrapped character called Rusty Beard, who seemingly had a ship that could navigate through Nickelodeon universes. Seems like the original plan for the story was a lot different, and seems like a concept that I would have preferred. I know I just got done complaining about Volcano Island not using iconic villains from the shows, but a character that can jump from universe to universe sounds like it would perfectly address the story issues I've had with these past two games. Anyway, let's see if the gameplay is able to make up for the underperforming story. Would you be surprised to hear that the gameplay has changed here yet again? This time, Blue Tongue has gone full-blown platformer. While a Nick 3D platformer in the style of Mario or a Banjo-Kazooie would be cool, they instead decided to go for something more akin to a Crash Bandicoot. Very linear levels, and sections that almost feel like a 2D platformer at times, but with some added depth. You technically have combat here, but the game is a platformer through and through. Each character has a melee attack, which has unique animations, but does the exact same damage, as well as a projectile attack that is just this goo weapon for everybody. Bit lame, but again, the combat is an afterthought. You aren't doing cool combos here or switching characters on the fly to beat certain enemies. Hell, most of the time you can simply run past enemies to just move on to the next platforming section. You could probably play most of this game without engaging in the combat, except for times where enemies will mess up your jump. As a result, everything in Attack of the Toybots hinges on the movement controls being tight. Fail here, and the entire gameplay premise comes crumbling down. The Nickelodeon gaming gods were generous on this day, because this game controls really well. I think the biggest compliment I can pay this game is that it gets ridiculously hard at times, but not once did I ever blame the controls for my deaths. It was rare that I'd blame the level design too. Attack of the Toybots genuinely has some of the most difficult 3D platforming I've ever experienced, but it also feels so rewarding for those reasons I just mentioned. You're not falling to your death because obstacles in your way are cheap. You're not messing up jumps because controls are sloppy, or the momentum of your character is all messed up. Most of the time, it's just your own skill going up against a well put together platforming challenge. One of the most crucial aspects that make this challenge remain fun from start to finish is that Blue Tongue decided to do away with lives and also have an insanely good respawn system. Most of the time you respawn basically right where you died, or at least at the beginning of the current platforming section you're attempting. This makes repeat attempts so much less frustrating, and I actually didn't mind getting my ass handed to me when I could almost immediately try again. Now, we can have a whole separate conversation about whether this difficulty is appropriate for a Nicktoons game. It feels like they overcompensated for Volcano Island being brain dead easy, and now they went too far in the opposite direction. There aren't any difficulty options, so the children that this game was targeted at would need to get good quickly, or they weren't going to progress far in Attack of the Toybots. For me, as an almost 30-year-old man, I enjoyed the challenge. I'll admit, the gameplay isn't without its flaws though. There were some sliding sections that just seemed to be bugged. I'd get stuck in the platforms while I was moving, which was less than ideal, as these platforms would eventually give way and drop me to my death. The solution to this was having to do some weird jumping strat to actually beat it, which I hardly think was the intention of the devs. AI companions continue their trend of being f***ing useless in Nicktoons games. This one actually takes the cake. I don't think I saw my AI companion do anything this time around. They're essentially pointless because, as I mentioned, the combat is an afterthought, and they don't even participate in the platforming. Most of the time they just teleport to you after you've put in the hard work. The existence of the companions is a little confusing, to be honest. The story mode doesn't have any co-op, so you can't have a friend join you here. The AI doesn't help you out, so it seems like they only exist to make jumping into the game's bonus levels a little easier, which I'll touch on shortly. There was this really tedious section where you have to shoot down these platforms, which is incredibly awkward. This whole section is reliant on you having ammo in your projectile goo shooter thing, so if you run out of ammo mid-platforming section, you're screwed. To make matters worse, the ammo pickups at the beginning of this section randomly respawn, so you regularly have to just jump off the platform and respawn so that hopefully the ammo shows up. R2 being the button for the dodge roll, as well as the ability to grab onto ledges, causes problems. Basically, anytime the game asks you to platform and then quickly grab onto a surface will result in you dodge rolling to your death if you're not completely careful. Just in general, I forgot that the grab button was a thing. The game uses it so sporadically that you'll always be caught off guard. If you're stuck in a section and don't know how to progress, there's a 99% chance it's because you're forgetting how to cling to a surface. Probably my biggest gripe with the gameplay is that every character feels the same. Outside of some slightly different animations, it feels like there's just one character here with different skins available. There's no reason why Timmy, Danny, and SpongeBob should all feel identical. After you beat the tutorial level, you'll gain the ability to choose which two characters you use in each level going forward. As far as I could tell, this only played into the bonus levels that are actually mandatory. How this works is you'll be going along your level and suddenly see a tube with a hologram of a character on it. This means that level can only be accessed by that specific character. Here you'll be sucked into a challenge level of sorts, with most of them being some sort of platforming challenge. Completing this takes you to a short combat section, where you then free a master model. What the hell is a master model, you ask? Well, the name still confuses me, but I took this to be that we were freeing captured Nickelodeon characters. This is partly how you unlock new characters to use, but not every master model is playable. In fact, more often they aren't playable. For the unplayable characters, all you get is a PNG you can view in the main menu.
Whoa! This is worthless.
Okay, I exaggerate, they're not worthless. You get to see thick-looking Tommy Pickles in these PNGs, Tommy Thickles, if you will, and also these master models are the game's Goofy Goober tokens.
I'm sorry, SpongeBob. You don't have enough Goofy Goober tokens.
As usual, these kinds of gatekeeping methods are lame. There's no way to collect enough master models through regular gameplay, so instead you need to replay levels with specific characters so you can access enough bonus levels. The good thing is Blue Tongue realized this was annoying, so you can spawn at various checkpoints that are close to the bonus levels. And they even tell you which characters are required when you're choosing where to spawn. This makes it better, but I still would have preferred they removed this barrier entirely. As for the bonus levels, they're okay. The first one I encountered was SpongeBob's, which is a tongue sliding level. Devs sure loved milking the literal one time SpongeBob ever did this. Controls are very slippery here, obstacles are laid out awkwardly, and it's just not fun. It's basically the complete opposite of the regular platforming gameplay. Also, SpongeBob is just deep-throating this disgusting sewer pipe, which is nasty. In my experience though, most of the other levels were different types of platforming challenges. For example, Tack had a bonus level that was all about wall jumping. These are an okay little distraction. Danny has a bonus level where he turns into sperm and has to shoot things. These were terrible.
Did you have to be so graphic?
I think the worst gameplay style actually occurs in the main game though. Out of nowhere, you'll suddenly be thrust into an Amity Park mech suit section. You're just blindsided with this and suddenly discover you're in some sort of shmup section. You walk around and push the right stick to attack, while R2 does a more powerful but ammo-based blast. This whole section sucks. It's so dull and repetitive. Even the usually very good soundtrack is phoned in here. And the level drags on forever. Also, just watch the screen go insane when you beat the boss of this level. Somehow Bluetongue thought ending the game on one of these levels would be a great idea. It results in one of the flattest endings to a game I've ever seen. You don't get an interesting boss battle, no climatic finale, just a dumb mech section that ends with no fanfare. I've touched on this a little bit when talking about the game's story, but how does Attack of the Toybots fare on a crossover level? Well, it's hard to argue that it's not the best of the bunch so far. The first two games had tiny rosters of playable characters, but here we have 11 characters covering 9 different franchises. Easily the best so far. The trade-off though, like I mentioned, is that none of these characters feel unique in the gameplay. When assessing this, it really depends on what you're looking for. Do you just like the idea of running around as Stimpy, Rocco, and XJ9 for the first time ever? If so, this is perfect. But if you want their unique character traits to be on display, well, that's missing, both in the gameplay and cutscenes. Those 3 characters I just mentioned don't even show up in cutscenes. I do appreciate that they showed love to both new and old Nicktoons. Shows like Ren and Stimpy and Rocco's Modern Life are so integral to Nick's history. This love then extends to the non-playable PNGs too. There are 14 of these in this version of the game, and basically cover every notable Nicktoon. It's also the only chance As Told by Ginger got to be in a game, so shout out to that I guess. Overall, there are 22 shows represented throughout this game by my count, which would be impressive if most of that representation wasn't just PNGs. What I did really love was the unlockable character costumes. As you're running around levels, you'll collect circuits, which acts as your currency. In the character select screen, you'll find that each character has one unlockable costume. Each one of these is a callback to a moment from the show, which was really cool, and you can tell Bluetongue were trying to appeal to hardcore Nick fans here. But then on the flip side, the whole game is really set in a drab factory, which feels like a waste. Similar to how Volcano Island was all just tropical island settings. I would have much preferred the seemingly scrapped concept of jumping to different universes, because each level feels exactly the same here. Even the couple of platforming levels that are supposed to be set in Bikini Bottom or Fairy World just feel like yet another drab repeat of the evil Toyco factory. Attack of the Toybots is probably the best game in terms of actual crossover so far, but it still misses on so many levels, and it leaves me hoping and praying that Globs of Doom somehow nails it to the level I always imagined as a kid dreaming about these crossovers. Presentation wise, the game is pretty good. Visually, I had no issues with it. It's pretty much on par with what we've seen from the other 2 home console games in the series, which doesn't really surprise me. Bluetongue were pumping out these games on a yearly cycle, so there's hardly much time for them to really evolve the graphical fidelity, especially when it feels like they were more focused on completely changing up the gameplay with each release. The audio is really where the game shines. One thing I have been consistently impressed with when reviewing Nickelodeon games is that they more often than not have great soundtracks. Even some of the most completely irredeemable games I've played could at least say that the soundtrack was nice. But the soundtrack here isn't just nice, it's next level. Well, apart from that Amity Park mech level. A lot comes down to composer Mick Gordon, who is most well known these days for his work as the composer on Doom Eternal. He was also part of the team for Borderlands 3, Wolfenstein 2, Prey, and the original Doom and Wolfenstein reboots. Incredibly, as far as I could tell, Attack of the Toybots was his first time being credited as a game's composer. He'd previously worked on a couple of other games in a smaller capacity. He'd then go on to be the composer for El Tigre and the live-action Last Airbender games, which has strangely made me interested in these games now just for the soundtracks. It is a bit of a shame he wouldn't return for Globs of Doom though. While the voice work is also generally pretty great, especially in the cutscenes where it feels like every actor is putting in a committed performance, the execution of the voice lines in general gameplay is a huge miss. The canned voice lines that characters say during levels are terrible on multiple levels. First, you've got the fact that the lines are just not good for the most part. Danny had some particularly egregious ones like this line.
Bad toy, no biscuit.
I tried to find if this was some sort of Danny Phantom reference because it's just such a bizarre line that I thought it had to be. But nope, this is apparently just something the devs thought Danny would say. But outside of these weird lines, there just aren't enough lines here to make it not come across as repetitive and annoying. It's especially frustrating to see that each character had like half a dozen unused voice lines that were discovered in the files because this game desperately needed them. And on top of that, the music completely cuts out when a character says a voice line, which is just rubbing salt into the wound. Not only do the voice lines suck, but they then take over the amazing soundtrack just for Danny to scold a toy for the 100th time. As a complete package, Attack of the Toybots is a good game. I'm not sure Blue Tongue needed to completely revamp the gameplay again, but ultimately they created a solid platformer that actually provides a challenge without feeling cheap because the controls or level design are janky. The amount of shows and characters present here is easily the best so far, but it's still lacking in story and actual character interactions. The dumb mech levels, and the fact the game ends on one, is a bit frustrating, but the game is a fun experience overall. I think Attack of the Toybots is definitely a step up compared to Battle for Volcano Island, but I don't know that it's a whole tier above it. That means I'm going to place it in A tier, hoping Globs of Doom can somehow transcend the original trilogy and jump into that mythical S tier. Natsume are back for their second attempt at a Nicktoons game on the DS, after taking the reins from Climax on Battle for Volcano Island. With the console version arguably being the best game so far, can they do the same for handhelds? With the DS boasting a decent level of power compared to the GBA, handheld ports from this era were able to start including a lot more story elements. This is on display immediately with Attack of the Toybots. The game starts out roughly the same, with Patrick being captured, but the events leading up to that are slightly tweaked. You then see some of the limitations of the platform, with Jimmy sort of just teleporting the core group into the scene. Also, Tax here for some reason. No explanation for his appearance here, and if you're somebody who cares about the lore of these games, it does stand out a bit. Apparently he's encountered the Unite crew off screen somewhere for some undisclosed reason. The cutscene that starts off the game is surprisingly long. Like, I was genuinely shocked I was sitting through this on the DS. You also get little story beats throughout the main campaign, which kept me satisfied. However, the biggest issue with the DS port story is how it treats the villain. Calamitous is the cause of all the chaos here, just like the console version, but the problem is you don't actually see him until the literal end of the game. You encounter him and take him on in the game's final boss fight, and then that's it. That's your exposure to the game's main villain. In a way, it's kind of similar to how Morgu was treated in Battle for Volcano Island. And in another weird story moment, the strange game show, TV show element is introduced right at the end too. It's like somebody at Natsume remembered this was part of the console game at the last second and had to rush to shove something in so it wasn't completely missing. Overall, the story is actually quite good for a DS port. It's not perfect, but it's better than I was expecting from a handheld. And I did get a kick out of this final cutscene, which not only features a cameo from Plankton, but also features these massively spaced out prison bars that Calamitous could easily just walk through. Unfortunately, because this port is staying true to the console version, the game still has the same issue when it comes to the variety of levels. In fact, I'd argue it's even worse here. Every single level is basically just the same boring factory with a new coat of paint. In this version, the levels are explicitly set in the worlds of the 5 main characters. Tak has apparently been added to the main crew. This might actually have been a holdover from the initial scrapped concept featuring Rusty Beard. Unfortunately, each level is still just a factory, and they might as well be the exact same thing. On the flip side, this character roster is amazing. It doesn't have the sheer number of characters that the console version does, but it matches it in terms of the number of more obscure, less loved by games characters that they include. You've got the core 4, Patrick and Tak, as I've mentioned, and then over the course of the story you unlock Jenny, El Tigre, Zim, and some cat scratch guy who the game informed me is called Mr. Blick. It seemed like Natsume were deliberately choosing characters who'd been given the least love by Nick games previously. Then on top of this, you can also unlock Gur. Unfortunately, they put a god-awful requirement in front of this. The only way to get Gur is by unlocking all of this game's master models equivalent. Essentially, you have to 100% the game for this. Not only is that insane from a game design standpoint, like cool, I've literally done everything in the game, why would I want to continue playing it? But Gur, and no offense to Gur, is not a good option for a 100% completion unlock. This needs to be some insane character to justify putting in all that work. There are also a couple of codes that you can input to unlock Dark Danny and SpongeGar. Now, you'd be forgiven for assuming these are just costume changes, and heck, Natsume would also be forgiven for literally doing that. Instead, these are brand new characters. I'll touch on gameplay in just a second, but Dark Danny changes up his melee moves compared to Danny, while SpongeGar becomes a melee character where SpongeBob is completely projectile focused. I love this level of care and effort being put in by Natsume. No idea where or how the codes used to unlock these characters were distributed though. Maybe somebody who played this game back when it was released can sound off in the comments below. There's also a decent level of interaction between the characters during cutscenes, and more importantly, this version actually allows characters outside of the core cast to be involved in dialogue. At minimum, each unlockable character gets a couple of cutscenes to interact with the crew during the level in which you free them. It's not perfect, but Natsume has done an incredible job with the crossover elements here. When kicking off the game, you have 5 characters to choose from, the main group and Tak. You then get to choose 2 characters to take into each level, another aspect that feels influenced by the console version. Controls are pretty simple. A is jump, B is your regular attack, which can also be held down for a charged version of that attack, X activates your special team power, and Y swaps the character you're controlling. Each character has their own health bar, so you'll definitely be switching characters, even if you're just being forced by the game once your character runs out of health. Throughout levels, you'll find yellow stars, which restore varying amounts of health. There are also green stars, which seemingly increase your team power gauge, but to me, it seemed like what these stars did was completely random. Sometimes it seemed to fill the team move, sometimes it filled my health, and sometimes it looked like it was filling both. Feels like this is a pretty straightforward mechanic to implement, but it was all over the place here. As far as I could tell, every single character had the exact same movement attributes. There's no nimble, fast characters or bulky characters that move slower. Instead, everybody just moves at the same glacial pace. Each character technically has a unique attack, but other than having a unique animation and occasionally a unique way they dish out a move, the attacks felt largely the same, doing roughly the same level of damage no matter who you choose. Characters are broken down into one of 2 types. They're either a melee character or a projectile character. Tak has a melee attack, SpongeBob has a ranged bubble blow attack, Danny has a melee attack, Jimmy has a ranged attack, Timmy has his iconic ranged vacuum attack that's appeared several times in Nicktoons Unite now, Patrick has his chaotic spin dash attack that he used in the console version of Volcano Island, Jenny has a melee attack where she straight up pimp slaps enemies. If you ever wanted to pimp slap a helicopter as XJ9, this is the game for you. El Tigre has a melee attack, and this is seemingly one of the only times where an attack has a noticeable difference. Don't know if I was imagining it, but it seemed like he attacked much more quickly than other melee characters, which actually allowed him to lock enemies in a feedback loop and just absolutely dominate the scene. Zim has a ranged attack, and Mr. Blick kinda throws a grenade. As mentioned, all characters have a charged version of their attack too. Outside of very rare specific occasions, using this is not recommended. The combat is already so stilted, literally all you can do is run up to enemies, stand still, and smack them, so introducing something that needs to be charged up just makes it all even worse. You can technically do a jumping attack, but again, the value in this is only seen in very specific scenarios. For those of you eager to figure out where I'll rank this game, we've basically got a beat 'em up that has bland and stilted combat, so you do the math on that. Filling the green bar allows you to unleash the team attacks I mentioned, which are pretty underwhelming. These moves are technically unique to the pairings of characters you pick, and by technically, I mean the animation that plays changes, but nothing else does. Essentially what happens is the game pauses while an animation of the characters randomly zipping around the screen plays out, resulting in every enemy on screen taking damage. It's a huge missed opportunity to not have this be genuinely unique. You might have picked up on the fact that Attack of the Toybots seems to be rather light on touch controls, and that's definitely true. The only real-time tapping the touchscreen is required is for the mandatory QTEs in every level. These are dull things like turning dials and activating switches, which kind of play out like a puzzle sometimes. They're mostly tedious and feel like padding though. I also found this game to be kind of weird from a difficulty standpoint. Natsume chose to actually program the teammate AI to occasionally help out in combat. It's still not great, but arguably some of the best teammate AI that this series has seen so far. To make things even easier, for you to get a game over, both characters need to die. But that's not all. Your dead character revives themselves after a few seconds, making it ridiculously hard to have both characters go down together. But then you discover that randomly your teammates will take damage, which will undoubtedly catch you off guard. The first time I noticed this was in the TAC level boss battle, where all of a sudden my teammate Timmy died. This injected a little more difficulty into a game that was feeling brain dead. It's almost like a lot of the mechanics in this version of Attack of the Toybots are broken. You're supposed to be able to fill your team move bar by damaging enemies, but the game is selective about when this actually works. I can't tell if all of these things were a weird design choice, or just a massive oversight. As you take down enemies and smash open crates, you'll collect bolts. Rather than being a currency, these actually act as health. For the boss battles, every level ends with a first-person shootout as a mech, which is just bizarre. I'll touch on those more in a minute. Mech sections have now been fully integrated into every level. These mechs absolutely melt enemies, and I'm kind of not sure why they even introduced this, other than for some more synergy with the home console version. However, by far the weirdest shakeup to the gameplay is the driving sections. The first one will catch you so off guard, especially with the little cutscene that precedes it. All of a sudden you find yourself driving, and the two purposes of these sections seem to be to collect more health for your boss battle, and to collect this game's version of master models. The actual controls for this are fine. They're not great, but they're manageable. But the way the level scrolls from top screen to bottom is super distracting. All up, you've got 6 worlds to play through. 5 of these are themed after the main cast, and then there's a final world, which is essentially the evil lair of Calamitous. Surprisingly, you can take on these worlds in any order, meaning you do have some choice about which characters you unlock first, although you won't know which character you're freeing until you actually start the level. There are also enough levels here for you to play each character at least once, not including Gur or the 2 characters unlocked via code, which I found to be really nice. It allowed me to experiment with each character, while also providing a steady stream of new characters so I wasn't stuck with characters I wasn't enjoying. Unfortunately, 5 of these 6 worlds are structured identically and makes the game a chore. Each of the first 5 worlds go like this. You start out in a beat 'em up section with 2 characters, while also having to do some sort of QTE puzzle or task 2 to 3 times. Eventually you come to a beat 'em up boss battle, which once defeated frees a trapped Nick character. After that you move to the beat 'em up mech section. Weirdly, using the mech for these sections isn't actually required. You can be knocked out of your mech, or you can just choose to not use it. Once you complete all of that, you head to the driving section, where you continue to beef up your collection of bolts, because next up is the first person boss battle. One of the real oversights here is that if you have been diligent in collecting bolts, these fights become incredibly dull, because you can simply stand still, fire at the enemy, and take it down without a care in the world, because you have way too much health. So with this formula repeated identically across the first 5 worlds, it doesn't take long for the game to get boring. There is a repetitive formula to literally everything this game does, and unfortunately the combat is not fun enough to make up for this. The only level that challenges this formula is the final level. Here you do a short beat 'em up section, and then a boss rush of a few bosses. This is then repeated until you finally make your way to Calamitous. Natsume tried to inject some strategy into these first-person boss battles with some interactive elements that help turn the tide in your favor, but again, I found that all you needed to do was stand there and spam fire, while occasionally moving side to side. That's if you didn't overload on health. This is all just very tedious and annoying. At least the beat 'em up boss battles feature one strange encounter with Rey Mysterio. The last thing I'm going to talk about is the presentation. Visually, the game is in a very weird spot. For some reason, they used 3D environments with 2D sprite work for the characters. I think both of these elements on their own are pretty good, but when mashed together, it just feels very off. I think they should have picked a single lane, because what we have here is not a good look. The sprite work isn't perfect either. There are some goofy looking animations, and Jimmy's sprite looks all sorts of messed up when walking. What is going on with his proportions here? And unfortunately, the soundtrack is just okay. It's not bad necessarily, but after having a track list of bangers in the home console version, and just the general standard of most Nickelodeon games, this is easily one of the lesser Nicktoons soundtracks. So where does Nicktoons Attack of the Toybots sit on the tier list? Well, unfortunately, I think we've got our first entry in D tier. When I look back at my experience, this really was not an enjoyable time. However, what saves it from the dreaded F tier is the fact that it really nailed a lot of the crossover and story elements. In fact, they nail it so well that I would still recommend this game. I mean, it's basically one of the only ways you're going to get to play as Jenny, Zim, or that dude from Cat Scratch. As long as you go in expecting the actual gameplay to be underwhelming, I think hardcore Nick fans could still get a kick out of this. Obviously, you're not coming to the GBA version of Attack of the Toybots for a Shakespearean story. Unsurprisingly, what you get here is pretty minimal. However, what was kinda interesting is that this version does its own thing the most out of any of the versions. The game kicks off and Calamitous has somehow captured the core group already and uses them to create robot versions of each character. They've also shoehorned in the world's biggest genius TV show thing again. No matter how many times this pops up, it still feels jarring and out of place. Cosmo and Wanda then appear, and unsurprisingly, there's some silly reason to explain why their powers are limited. They only have the ability to free one character, and this allows you to choose which character you start the game with. And actually, this is basically you choosing who the main character is for the game, which will become clearer later on, but the game doesn't really explain that to you. I constantly yearn for more Tak content because I'm an obscure IP nostalgia merchant, so I chose him to be the star of our GBA Toybots journey. Once free, it was up to Tak to unlock the cages of the other characters, and then that's basically it for story. While I expected the game to be light in this department, I wasn't expecting the same when it came to the crossover. The 5 characters you see at the start are the 5 characters you get to play. It's the core 4 of SpongeBob, Danny, Timmy, and Jimmy. Look at this dude's big ass head, by the way. With Tak also being added. It seems with Attack of the Toybots, they were really trying to establish him as one of the main characters of this franchise, which kind of makes sense when you consider the state of things at the time. While it had been a couple of years since the last Tak game released, the Tak TV show finally started airing in 2007, and the following year we'd get Guardians of Gross and Mojo Mistake. This looks like Nickelodeon's attempt to keep him relevant while they hoped the show would take off. So we've got a very limited roster, albeit technically the most we've ever had on the GBA, and there isn't really any interaction between the characters here either. I almost got my hopes up in the first level when I randomly came across Carl, but couldn't seem to interact with him. My initial thought was that I'd need to come back with Jimmy to collect or recruit him or something. Unfortunately, that was wishful thinking. These cameos are literally just that, cameos. They're sprites that stand there looking ridiculous.
He's just standing there, menacingly!
So after pretending to make Tak give him some sloppy toppy, I proceeded on my way, never to think about these weird cameos again. That's the entire extent of this game being a Nick crossover really. I find it super weird that they went through the effort of creating sprites for these other Nick characters, but didn't use them for anything meaningful. Hell, I would have even taken them just being costumes for the existing characters. They didn't need to have any brand new powers. One thing I will give this game credit for is that the stages feel unique. They don't just look like boring factories and instead feel like they actually capture some of the charm of the different worlds of the shows. Each level always has a second half to it which is just a factory, but the opening of each level is a breath of fresh air. As for gameplay, well, we've got our third different developer for the GBA version in as many games. This time Firemint is in control and they're here to put their spin on the franchise. Controls for this GBA game are simple, what a shocker. A is your jump and double jump, while B attacks. Tak, Danny and Jimmy have ranged attacks. Technically SpongeBob kinda has a ranged attack, but it can only be used underwater. Characters also get a melee attack, also activated by B, with the game deciding which attack you use based on how close you are to the enemy. It's a system that works okay most of the time, but you'll definitely feel cheated by the game's decisions at times during combat. Timmy's melee attack is a bit strange. This turns enemies into objects, which can then be used as platforms. It's an interesting combat quirk that's also supposed to sync up with the platforming, but it really just doesn't work. Getting enemies to change is super finicky, and you can only change one enemy at a time. This gets particularly annoying if you change an enemy, move on, and then find that you need to wait for the first enemy to turn back to normal before you can progress. They did something similar with Jimmy's ranged attack, which just shrinks enemies, and he doesn't have any type of melee attack. I appreciate the devs trying something unique with these characters, but it just doesn't work well, and they easily become the two worst characters in the game. Because you get the freedom to choose which characters you unlock, I definitely recommend unlocking them last. You'll understand why in a minute. Each character gets an exclusive special power that's used to traverse levels in a unique way. Tak can climb ropes, Danny can use ghost mode to go through walls or jump on new platforms, Timmy can turn into a frog to go through tight tunnels, Jimmy hacks platforms to change their direction, and SpongeBob can go underwater. As you're doing all this, you'll find gems scattered around, as well as being dropped by defeated enemies. Once you collect 25, you unlock a stun blast attack that essentially clears the entire screen of enemies. It's a similar function to the team attacks on the DS, but unfortunately it doesn't work too well. Stun blasts don't stack, so you better use it before you collect another 25 gems, otherwise you've just wasted the opportunity for an attack. There also just aren't many good opportunities to use this, to the point where I'd forget I even had this power. It's not often that you're getting overwhelmed by enemies here. At most, you're facing 1 or 2 enemies 99% of the time. Levels have branching paths that exist purely to grab these gems, which just feels silly. Platforming controls really well, to the point where I almost would have liked to see more emphasis on platforming. Levels featuring a greater test of platforming skill could have been really fun if executed well. Overall, the game is pretty easy. Enemies are dispatched with ease, and if you do take damage, all subsequent enemies will drop health instead of gems until you're back at 100% health. You have 5 hearts of health, and the game is so generous with its checkpointing that there really isn't any challenge here. They'll occasionally drop power-ups in to spice things up, things like energy shields to block projectiles, invisibility, speed boost, and the ability to slow down time like you're the Flash or Quicksilver. Most levels end with you jumping into a tank for a short section before heading into a boss battle that can be tackled via the tank or on foot. Again, these are pretty easy, especially when you've got Timmybot unaliving himself without any assistance required from the player. After beating the first level and all following levels, you'll be surprised by a character upgrade. This is only applied to the character you first selected, which is why your initial choice essentially makes them the main character. Beating a level also allows you to unlock a new character, which confused me at first because I then got shoved into the next level where I could still only use Tack. I naively assumed I'd just play as Tack for the whole game or something, but getting to the end of level 2 hit me with something that sent a shiver down my spine. Reaching the end goal made the game flash up text that said, "Well done, now get your other friends through the end." That's right, you need to beat every level with every character. Longtime viewers will know that I despise Lost Vikings style gameplay where you have multiple characters that need to get through the same level. Now this is slightly different to something seen in Ed, Edd n Eddy Jawbreakers, but it still has that same repetition. The idea is that each character's special powers change how you get through the level, unlocking new areas you previously couldn't access. This is kinda cool in theory, like many of the mechanics in this game, but it just doesn't work. At its core, you're still playing through the same level, and most levels don't feature nearly enough new areas to explore. The SpongeBob themed level was particularly bad, as it takes forever for the branching paths to start appearing, so you're just playing through the same thing a bunch of times. Once it gets to the final level, you'll be begging the game for mercy. Nicktoons Attack of the Toybots on GBA makes a decent first impression throughout its first level, but it's really all downhill from there. The more you play, the worse it gets, and the repeated theme is that Firemint has interesting ideas, but the execution is lacking. It sucks to say because the home console version was so good, but Attack of the Toybots on GBA joins the DS version down in D tier. If they'd stuck to having you play through levels one time, I honestly think that would have been enough to make it jump into C tier. It controls well enough, and the gameplay loop, at least when playing with Tack or Danny, felt enjoyable enough in a switch your brain off and just sort of vibe kind of way. These same factors are also what saves it from F tier, but the gimmick of making you go through levels multiple times with different characters just ruins it. Levels don't ever branch enough to make them feel completely unique, and the game ends up just being tedious, especially towards the end. When combined with the lackluster crossover elements, this is definitely one you can skip. If you are crazy enough to play this, make sure you unlock Timmy and Jimmy last, so you at least spare yourself from having to use them as much as possible. If you want to get an insight into where Nickelodeon was at as a channel in 2008, or how massive SpongeBob was as a brand, you only need to look at this game's title. Prior to Globs of Doom, every game in this series had just been titled Nicktoons with a subsequent subtitle. Even the other party games featuring a big Nicktoons crossover really lent into the Nicktoons branding, with games like Nicktoons Racing, Nickelodeon Party Blast, and Nicktoons Movin' featuring SpongeBob prominently, but prioritizing the channel or Nicktoons branding first. But for the final game in the series, we have this really bizarre title, SpongeBob featuring Nicktoons, Globs of Doom.
With the most Sizzlack experience featuring Homer.
It's an obvious attempt to cash in on SpongeBob's popularity, even though the game isn't any more focused on SpongeBob than any of the other shows featured in Globs of Doom. No idea who was the catalyst for this name change, but it may have been a last-ditch attempt to boost sales for this series and keep it going. As we know, this would be the last game in the Nicktoons Unite series. And to end this series, we happen to have a brand new developer for the home console version. This was Blue Tongue's Series, having developed all of the prior home console games. However, they'd moved on to developing De Blob at this time, so Incinerator Studios were brought on board. Incinerator was an interesting developer to bring on board here, because they were mostly known for racing games, like MX vs ATV Untamed. They did have some licensed game history, but these were for 3 different Cars video games, which makes sense given their history. While it's disappointing to lose Blue Tongue, considering how well De Blob was received, it's hard to argue that it was a bad decision. The story kicks off with Squidward immediately getting mind controlled by a brain slug.
Wait a second, he's got a brain slug on his head!
Jimmy then appears out of nowhere, which he's been frequently known to do in this series, transporting SpongeBob to Volcano Island for some reason. Apparently Jimmy has set up shop in Morgu's lair, which I appreciate the callbacks to previous Nicktoons lore, but there's never really any explanation or justification for why we're here, at least from what I can recall. Danny then shows up out of nowhere. Oh, and also there's a bunch of villains here too. Zim then shows up to finally get a bit of love in one of these home console versions, and we even get an appearance of the wise old crab. Globs of Doom really feels like a celebration of Nicktoons Unite history in the first 5 minutes, even though there really isn't much justification for why anything is happening. Jimmy gives each character a custom weapon, and then we're off to save the world from brain slugs, goo, globs I guess. Again, not much explanation here. While the actual narrative here is lacking, this opening cutscene is brilliant due to the character interactions. The writing for those are superb, and it actually made me not really care about the story being a whole load of nonsense. This extends across most of the game. Cutscenes are lengthy and we get great, authentic interactions between a bunch of characters that would usually never be seen together. While playing the game, these interactions were more than enough for me, but after finishing everything, I couldn't help but feel a little let down. The narrative is so undercooked here. There really isn't much explanation for what's going on with the game's enemies. You get very brief glimpses late in the game with SpongeBob randomly having a mind link with the main villain, like he's a Horcrux or something.
You've lost, old man.
This link allows the enemy to relay some sort of generic take over the world plan to the game's heroes. We learn that the main villain's name is Globulus Maximus, and he's the ruler of the Morphoids, whatever they are, and that's about it. It's very underwhelming, and it isn't until like the final 5 minutes where you finally learn some backstory and motivation for the villain. I found the ending of the game to be egregiously bad too. Spoilers incoming for anybody who might not have played Globs of Doom before but is planning to eventually. For the final boss battle, you kinda just randomly go into space. Apparently Globulus Maximus had just been chilling up there. This was never really touched on. After you beat him, the villains decide to do the most obvious betrayal ever and try to control Globulus Maximus. The game then gives you some insane backstory where you basically find out how the universe was created, you feed him a bunch of Krabby Patties, and then the dude turns into a horrific version of SpongeBob. It all culminates in a horrific mech boss battle against the villains. Because this game can be played in co-op, there are actually 2 endings to the game. If the person controlling the villains in the final boss battle wins, you get a bad ending, which is kind of a neat addition, even if the story is a big letdown. The interactions between the Nicktoons really save this game's story, because the actual narrative sucks. But at the end of the day, I still feel like a child stuck in 2008 at heart, so seeing all of these characters bantering with each other made me feel not dead inside for once. As for the crossover element, Globs of Doom is an interesting one. Rather than going deep with playable characters from Nicktoons history like Attack of the Toybots did, it instead gives shine to antagonist characters. The playable characters on offer here are SpongeBob, Plankton, who actually gets enlarged by Jimmy so he can be playable for the first time. Also, the attack sounds he makes are insane. Zim, Dib, Danny Phantom, Technus, Jimmy Neutron, Beautiful Gorgeous, and I'm just finding out that this character's name is actually Beautiful Gorgeous. I wasn't a big Jimmy Neutron fan growing up, so this blew my mind that that was her name. And also, why is Beautiful Gorgeous's head so big? Tack and Slaylock. And then we've also got a bunch of non-playable characters here that appear as well. The emphasis on heroes teaming with villains means we get some really unique characters here, as well as bizarre pairings. While I would have preferred something that tried to honor Nicktoons' massive legacy, it is an interesting route to take for the game, and I kind of enjoyed it. Although there are some weird choices. Some of the antagonists picked are very strange. Like, wouldn't you have assumed Calamitous would be here given his extensive history in the series? Also, Timmy not being present is odd too, but I guess this was kind of around the time where the rights got weird. There also aren't any unique costumes like Attack of the Toybots. I think the major thing missing from the crossover aspect, outside of shoving in as many playable characters as possible, a la Attack of the Toybots, is some fan servicey costumes. If they'd added some of these in, it might have made up for the fact that we lost so many playable characters when transitioning from Attack of the Toybots. In terms of gameplay, Globs of Doom offers a pretty standard brawler or beat 'em up. 95% of the combat is summed up by you just mashing the melee attack button, with an occasional ground pound thrown in. Combat is relatively smooth, albeit very basic, And I absolutely despise that you can be hit by enemies during your ground pound. It makes things way more tedious. I also found that the game doesn't really lean into the character's unique traits at all when it comes to combat. Whether you're playing as Plankton or Danny Phantom, every character just feels the same. There aren't really any unique moves or movement quirks. The one place where things are different is in the gadget that Jimmy gave every character in the beginning. You build up ammo for this attack by defeating enemies, which then allows you to unleash your gadget on the globs. Most gadgets essentially freeze a single enemy, or sometimes multiple enemies depending on the character. You've got things like SpongeBob putting enemies into a bubble, or Beautiful Gorgeous immobilizing them with raw sex appeal. Also, side note, why is everything she does in this game so horny? Danny's gadget move is pretty much the only one that feels unique, as it summons a ghost Danny to fight alongside you. Unfortunately, this ghost is pretty useless with the AI just basically not doing anything, so it actually kinda sucks. Separate to these gadget attacks, you'll also be filling a meter for what the game calls gadget combos. It takes a weirdly long time to fill up the meter for these, and once activated, you need to perform specific movements with the motion controls if you're playing on the Wii to pull them off. I found that the gadget combos really weren't all that much more powerful than regular gadget attacks. The Tlaylock and Dib combo was basically the only time where it felt worth the effort in filling this meter. I constantly found myself forgetting about these moves as the gameplay is so easy, you really never require it. Combine that with the fact that it takes forever to charge up, I actually had some levels where I didn't feel the meter at all, and you have a very forgettable mechanic that might as well not exist. Ultimately, the gameplay is fine here. It's not terrible or anything, but you've just got a kind of boring brawler with occasional light platforming elements thrown in. There's no depth here, and it gets repetitive quickly when all you're doing is mashing the attack button. Definitely a game that should be played in short bursts, so you don't bore yourself with the combat. There's also pretty much nothing stopping you from running away from like 90% of the enemy encounters here, which I thought was interesting. Perhaps a good way to alleviate the boredom in the gameplay is the co-op system. As has basically become tradition in the series, Globs of Doom allows 2 players to join in on the adventure. In single player, you'll control one character at a time, switching between each on the fly with both characters sharing a single health bar. Immediately, I noticed that the AI teammates were once again very keen to throw themselves to their deaths during the platforming, barely even attempting to make jumps. In fact, it almost felt like this was a gag from the developers with how much it was happening. Surprisingly, the teammate AI is actually kind of competent in the combat. For every other Nicktoons Unite game, they may as well have not existed, but in Globs of Doom they actually contribute to the point where they'll beat the glob out of enemies during cutscenes. To try and give the gameplay a slight amount of depth, there is an upgrade system where you spend these coins you collect throughout levels. It's simple stuff where you upgrade the power of your melee and ground pound attacks, health, and a few aspects of the gadgets, like how quickly they power up. They don't make a huge difference, but grabbing the coins at least gives you something else to focus on during levels. Globs of Doom thankfully moves away from the choice of Battle for Volcano Island and Attack of the Toybots to mostly utilize original settings for the levels, this time opting for familiar locations from the shows represented. There are 5 different worlds here, one for each show, and each world is structured exactly the same. You get 2 normal beat 'em up levels, followed by a boss battle. And as a funny addition, each level is preceded by a sliding section, which again rehashes SpongeBob's tongue sliding. The other characters just kind of skate along on their feet though, which is kind of weird. Feels like the devs really wanted to include more SpongeBob tongue sliding without putting any thought into how this would work for other characters. As for the levels themselves, while I do like them using iconic locations, the actual level design is pretty poor. They often feel really barren, with these huge stretches of emptiness. I also completely fell through a level at one point. Pretty much the only mini objective found throughout levels is freeing NPCs from goo.
Oh no, sir, help, I'm stuck!
Freeing these characters sends them back to Morgu's lair, which is kind of cool I guess, even though they don't have much of an effect on anything. Better than Attack of the Toybots GBA's random JPEGs I guess. The last gameplay aspect I want to touch on is the boss battles. I was actually quite impressed with the first one, which sees you come up against Bubble Bass. The players need to cook Krabby Patties while fending off enemies and dodging Bubble Bass's attacks. Once the patties are cooked, you fling them into his mouth. It's a cool concept and is actually a good showcase of the improved teammate AI. Without a competent teammate, I actually think this boss battle would have been extremely tough. But then unfortunately, every other boss battle in this game sucks. The Gur boss battle is boring and generic, especially coming right after Bubble Bass. Same for the encounter with the three-headed Devil Dog.
Devil Dog!
And then the boss battle for Jimmy Neutron's world completely glitched on me. While starting out this battle, I somehow glitched onto this platform, which unbeknownst to me, allowed me to do the fight out of sequence. Eventually this meant a specific animation wouldn't play out for me, meaning I was stuck and couldn't progress. As I mentioned earlier, the final boss battle has you randomly transported to space, where you jump into a mech. The combat in this boss battle is a complete mess. The melee hit detection is basically broken, and the game gives you a ranged attack, but never actually tells you about this. You just kinda have to discover it on your own, which isn't exactly intuitive when you haven't had a ranged attack for the entire game up until this point. Then you get the extra final boss battle against the villains, which is laughably easy and just didn't need to exist. They really could have made this a cutscene and it would have been a lot more enjoyable. Visually, the game is solid and a definite step up from Attack of the Toybots, but nothing spectacular. There are some occasional quirks with character models, like Beautiful Gorgeous having a comically large head even for her standards. And why does this cinema worker look like this? And why is he in the toilet? Impressively, for Incinerator's first time on the series, they managed to make all of the characters look pretty natural when together in the cutscenes. At this point, it's a given for them to look natural in gameplay, but it can be quite tricky pulling this all together in cutscenes. The one exception is Jimmy, who looks like out of place nightmare fuel. Why is he so greasy? The soundtrack is also solid, but doesn't really have any major standouts, especially in comparison to the insane soundtrack from Attack of the Toybots. For me, the best tracks probably came throughout the TAC world, but it's mostly forgettable outside of that. While I loved the interactions between characters and the fan service of the simple addition of making the game set on Volcano Island, even though it literally adds nothing and isn't really explained, ultimately the gameplay really lets Globs of Doom down. So much so that I have to place it in B tier. To me, this feels like a big step back in a lot of areas, probably because a brand new developer had to be brought in. If Blue Tongue was given one final shot, I feel like this would have been the S tier Nicktoons game we deserved. Instead, a brand new developer had to come in and try to put this together in one shot. In my insane time spent covering licensed video games, I've often found it's almost impossible for devs to make a truly great game on their first attempt with an IP. However, when they're given a chance to iterate, they usually are able to put out something great on their second or even third attempt. Unfortunately, Globs of Doom was the final ever Nicktoons console game, so in my opinion, we'll never truly have that S tier Nicktoons game on home consoles. So we've finally arrived at the last game in the Nicktoons Unite saga, and yet again we have Natsume as the developer of the DS version. They developed every DS version in the series, except for the very first. So in a weird way, the DS line of games is kind of theirs, even though they weren't there from the beginning. Unfortunately for big Nicktoons Unite lore fans, this version is very light on story. You get maybe 2 minutes of cutscenes at the very beginning, which admittedly look pretty cool, but then that's about all there is. I did get a kick out of Jimmy saying we're going to need all the help we can get to save the world, and then it turns out they just bring in 4 villains. Couldn't even attempt to contact some of the other heroes from Attack of the Toybots? Also, where the hell are Tak and Beautiful Gorgeous in this opening cutscene? They're playable in this version, yet they're entirely missing from the opening with no explanation. Just a bizarre oversight here. The heroes and villains randomly pair up during this opening cutscene, and then that's about it for the story. Unless you count SpongeBob trying to be a part of every level, only to be yeeted from it each time, which is a pretty good running gag. Even the lead up to the final fight with Globulus Maximus skips the story outside of a few lines once he's defeated. You also don't get the heel turn from the villainous group here either. Overall, it feels like a very rushed adaptation of the home console game. As for the gameplay, we're continuing the tradition of having yet another brand new style on display here. Globs of Doom keeps the dual character action as you'd expect, and utilizes the co-op scenario in a much bigger way than most games in this series. You'll often find characters being dropped into a level and then being completely separated. Once you gain control of them, you're at the helm of a puzzle platformer that bears some resemblance to the Lost Vikings. Now, longtime fans of the channel will know I usually despise this type of game. If you're not aware, these types of games feature multiple different characters that you have to switch between, each with unique powers focused on traversing a level. To progress, you need to swap back and forth to move past roadblocks. When done poorly, a game like this is tedious, and it feels like you're just playing through the same level multiple times, which is pretty boring. Ed, Edd n Eddy Jawbreakers on the GBA is a good example of this being executed poorly. Despite my initial skepticism about the gameplay here, I actually found that I rather enjoyed the puzzle platforming. Each character generally has one special ability you'll need to master to get from A to B. SpongeBob blows a bubble that can be jumped on to reach higher platforms, Technus can glide, Plankton is able to squeeze through small spaces, as well as Rocket Ride to get across gaps, Danny can go ghost, Tack can freeze enemies to use as a platform, Jimmy has a jetpack, Dib has a projectile attack that can deactivate switches, Zim can grapple up to high platforms, and Talaylock has pocket sand.
Pocket sand!
All of this is activated via the face buttons, with the touchscreen serving no major purpose other than showing you a kind of handy map. Characters' abilities occasionally have dual uses, such as SpongeBob's bubble being able to switch the direction of these fans, but I found the game never really taught the player these extra side uses of the abilities, and it did cause a bit of frustration. However, for the most part, I wasn't frustrated by the puzzle platforming, and the secret sauce here is that the levels are designed to flow really well. One of the biggest issues of something like Jawbreakers is that it feels like you take character 1, play through the first segment of the level, take character 2, play through the first segment of the level, and then take character 3 and play through the first segment of the level. Then you just repeat this for however long the level is. Here, the fact that they regularly separate the two characters helps massively, because you're running through completely unique sections of the level. It also helps that what you're doing in these solo sections is genuinely helping the other character progress. You're always removing roadblocks for your partner. And when things do seem like they're going to be tedious and you're going to have to just dully repeat a stretch of level, Natsume solved this by dropping in these well-timed teleporters at certain points where you're able to just literally teleport your partner to you. There's also the fact that levels are around 5 to 10 minutes in length, so they never really overstay their welcome. Probably my biggest issue with the core gameplay is my same issue with the story. The game feels rushed and nothing ever truly evolves. We have 5 worlds covering each show's location, with 2 to 3 levels present in each world, but the game rigidly sticks to the character pairings, so the kind of things you're doing in each level gets a bit repetitive, particularly in worlds with 3 levels. There's only so many ways you can combine 2 unique powers. I would have loved for the pairings to be rotated around and see what puzzles Natsume could come up with, but I get the vibe there wasn't enough development time for that. But the biggest issue with Globs of Doom on DS as a whole is that the game isn't just a puzzle platformer, it also has combat. Basic, and eventually as you progress further, tedious as hell combat. Every character has a basic attack and a running charge attack, as well as a special co-op attack that you can charge up when together. But the problem is that stopping and fighting enemies feels clunky. It really doesn't feel like it's supposed to be part of the game, and it ruins the flow completely. Occasionally some enemies will be resistant to a specific character, which will cause more frustration, as these enemies appear so infrequently that you'll likely forget this mechanic exists and be confused as to why this enemy isn't taking any damage. The combat gameplay then extends into the boss battles, which seemed extra silly to me. They could have easily made these boss encounters focused around puzzle platforming like the core of the game is, but instead you're here fighting, and it feels awful. I will give Natsume some credit here though, because the AI companion will fight here, and it's damn near the best teammate AI in the entire Nicktoons Unite series. Whether you're encountering the randomly placed enemies throughout levels or slogging through the boss battles, it just feels so clear to me that this game was never meant to feature lengthy combat. It's not even remotely fun. I'm not exaggerating when I say all of the shittiest moments of this game come when enemies are involved. If Globs of Doom DS was a pure puzzle platformer, we'd be having a conversation about this game potentially being S tier. It gets worse the further you go on, culminating in the Zim and Tlaylock world, fully ruining the game for me. These two have the worst attacks in the game, and when you combine that with some truly frustrating enemy placement, it was enough to not only ruin a lot of the goodwill the game had built up, but it got me to stop playing entirely. The fun had just been sapped from the game at this point. Visually, I think the sprite work and animations look fantastic, but boy does this game have some funny quirks. Why is Tlaylock asleep on the World Select screen? Also, Plankton in general is just funny as hell in this game. What is this sprite when Plankton double jumps? And how could anybody look at Plankton's running attack and not find it hilarious? Makes him diving to kill Vlad in the boss battle just feel completely insane. The audio side of things also has these quirks. It is unbelievably annoying that the characters basically scream every time you switch to them, which quickly wears you down in a game where you're switching characters constantly.
Yes! Woohoo! Woohoo! Yeah!
And why does Tlaylock say woohoo when you switch to him? When just focused on the puzzle platforming, Globs of Doom on DS can be pretty damn enjoyable. It does feel a bit basic because they never mix up the character pairings, but its short length makes sure this never really becomes too big of a deal. Unfortunately, the combat rears its ugly head, and it completely ruins all of that good work. So much so that I have to bust this game down to C tier. And with that, we have played, reviewed, and ranked every single Nicktoons Unite game. Or have we? While not being a Nicktoons Unite game in name, there is one important game that we need to throw it back to because it was the pioneer when it came to Nickelodeon non-party game crossovers. The multiverse has gone haywire and characters from different universes are mysteriously converging. Am I describing the plot of Nicktoons Freeze Frame Frenzy or Spider-Man No Way Home? Story rarely plays a big part in GBA games, so that small description is almost everything you need to know here. Emphasis is squarely on the gameplay. On Wikipedia, Freeze Frame Frenzy is likened to Gekibo Gekisha Boy, and the resemblance is seriously uncanny. This was a Japanese exclusive game, so it may seem weird for this Nickelodeon game to lift its gameplay from a source like this, but Altron was a Japanese developer, so it makes sense. Essentially what we have here is lo-fi Pokemon Snap. Gameplay is dedicated to taking photos.
I am a photographer, and I took this photo. That's it, thank you.
The photos you take will rack up points, and reaching a required high score is needed to progress to a new area. Just like Pokemon Snap and Gekibo, the entire experience is on rails. Assuming the role of Professor Oak in this game is Jimmy Neutron, quite a fitting replacement. Because this is a Nick crossover game, you get to choose between different characters to snap photos. At the start, you only have a couple of options, but as you progress, the game drip feeds the rest of the roster. Altron attempts to make these choices meaningful. Usually you just pick your favorite character, but in Freeze Frame Frenzy, there are stats unique to every character. Jump power, walking speed, running speed, endurance, and flash gauge charging speed are the things that will set your characters apart from one another. At least in theory. In my experience, literally none of this matters. I'll dissect each stat one by one. Okay, jump power. This is completely meaningless. The ability to jump didn't come into play for me a single time. Walking speed and running speed never felt relevant as the game is on rails. Even if you run, you're bound to how fast the screen is scrolling, so you don't get moments like in the Pokemon Snap games, where you can speed up your vehicle and catch unique special moments you'd otherwise miss. Endurance does matter because this is a fancy way of referring to your health, but I can't say I ever died in a regular level here. I guess if you're a kid playing this game, it may have played a more prominent role. And then finally, you have your flash gauge charging speed. Like the health, this technically matters as it determines how quickly this meter will fill. Only issue is I have no clue what the point of this meter was. The only possible use I discovered was that using it would freeze these little enemies in place. Cool, I guess, but the enemies are so slow and infrequent that you can dispatch them with ease, which is done by taking a photo of them. It really feels like an entire system has been tacked on here purely for show. Nothing related to these stats plays any role in the game. There's always the possibility that I've completely missed some crucial aspect that uses all of these mechanics, but if I have, the game certainly doesn't let you know. There's an album you need to fill out alongside your main quest, and by the time I'd finished the game, I had 99% completion on it. If running, jumping, and using the flash gauge mattered, they surely weren't doing a good job of letting me know. Every character I used moved and felt exactly the same. There was so much potential to use the unique nature of each character to tie into the gameplay. How are you going to have Danny not even go ghost here? Even if all of this character stuff did matter, you're not given the opportunity to change characters that frequently, so you'd just be stuck with your choice for extended periods. But let's actually discuss the core gameplay. Each level sees you being dumped into a new world themed around a specific show, with Jimmy giving you 3 objectives alongside a points goal. These objectives center on things like taking photos of characters who aren't from that world, or capturing specific notable moments, like Otto doing sick tricks on the halfpipe. Successfully completing these objectives will net you large chunks of points, so they're usually crucial to you completing the level. Taking photos of out of place characters is the next biggest focus because it'll net you 1000 points every time, except when it doesn't. So many times I'd take a photo of one of these characters and the game just wouldn't do anything. Some of these definitely required me to trigger a special event before it would work, but other times it just seemed like it wasn't working. One of the big aspects of Pokemon Snap is that you have a limited amount of photos, forcing you to be selective with what you capture. Usually the number of photos you have is pretty generous, but the existence of this limit really influences the way you play. In Freeze Frame Frenzy, you have unlimited photos and it kills any sort of nuance or strategy for the gameplay. As soon as the level starts, just spam the capture button because there aren't any consequences. Doing this practically ensures you'll complete every single objective and hit the target score on your first time through. Pokemon Snap also has a system in place to prevent this. Rather than getting points as soon as you take a photo, your photos are scored when your run is finished. Your shots are judged on basic photography techniques as well as whether the subject was performing any notable actions. That kind of system is entirely absent in Freeze Frame Frenzy, which just further emphasizes that spamming photos is the way to go here. It feels like this entire game hasn't been thought through properly. Like, there are plenty of weird and wacky things characters do throughout levels. You could easily make capturing these moments worth more points like Pokemon Snap does, but instead you're just stuck with the same scoring system no matter what.
I saw that! You disgusting pervert! That's absolutely unacceptable!
At the end of each world, you get a boss battle against a robotic version of a character. These always try to have some sort of interesting flavor to them, but it always boils down to the same thing. You take a photo of them once to stun them, then a second time to chip off some health. The formula is so basic that you end up beating them in seconds most times, without ever really trying. Just yet another aspect of Freeze Frame Frenzy with zero depth. One of my biggest issues, alongside the fact that there is no depth here, is that levels are agonizingly slow. There's no way to speed them up, and the glacial pace combined with the unlimited photos means it's brain dead easy. Increasing the speed of levels would have at least raised the odds of you missing crucial photos and maybe even failing a level. I also quickly felt bored of levels because they're all basically the same. You can change what show they're themed to, set it in a jungle or a high school, but at the end of the day, being on the GBA means every level is just a flat 2D plane you scroll through. Even the concept of taking photos in a bathroom like a pervert isn't enough to keep you from falling asleep here. Freeze Frame Frenzy feels like a great example of bringing a genre to handhelds that just doesn't work. I have no idea how you could differentiate these levels enough to make them not feel exactly the same. I guess my one radical idea would have been to remove the on-rails element. Instead, set levels out like a 2D platformer, with the goal still being to take photos, but just in a more unique way. The core gameplay loop of slowly scrolling through levels loses steam really quick. It's an issue I have with both Pokemon Snap games actually. The idea just isn't something I find fun the longer I play it. Freeze Frame Frenzy is a game screaming for some gameplay variation, and they give it to you. They just tack it all onto the end of the game. Impressively, they managed to shoehorn a shmup level into this final stretch. I'm just in awe. At this point, I'd be surprised if a Nick game didn't have a level dedicated to the worst shmup gameplay known to man. Here, the photo snapping has been retrofitted into a space-flying shmup. Asteroids are hurtling towards you and you need to take photos of them to not get hit. Periodically, satellites appear and taking photos of those will pop out a fuel canister. Take a photo of that and you'll progress towards the end of the level. Your progress is tracked at the top and you'll notice that every time you take damage, you're pushed back. This is actually painful. The fact that you lose health when hit is enough of a punishment and provides the game with actual difficulty for the first time ever. But adding in the extra element of you losing progress with each hit just makes it tedious. It was so bad I was almost ready to quit the game, despite being moments from completing the entire thing. They then follow up this shmup section with a few more sections and styles of gameplay not found elsewhere in the game. None of these are ever amazing, but it's the kind of change-up Freeze Frame Frenzy could have used peppered throughout the whole experience, not just shoved into the end. So let's talk about the crossover elements. Now, it's painfully clear that Nick's directive for this game was for Altron to focus on their current slate of shows. The fact that Rugrats is only here in its all grown up form should make that obvious. Playable characters are Timmy Turner, SpongeBob, Otto Rocket, Danny Fenton, Tommy Pickles, Arnold, Jimmy Neutron, and Zim. Although not playable, Wild Thornberrys, My Life as a Teenage Robot, and Tak and the Power of Juju are all featured in the game too. If an early 2004 press release is to be believed, it seems like Tak was planned to be playable too. As a crossover Nicktoons title focused specifically on what was airing in 2004, they've done a pretty great job. As Told by Ginger and Chalk Zone were the only shows not to make an appearance. Considering As Told by Ginger had been cancelled by the time this game released, it makes sense why it doesn't get any representation here. Chalk Zone is really the only notable omission. Naturally, there's heaps of references packed in, and that's pretty cool to see, but the cool factor of this crossover wears off rather quickly. Seeing characters pop up in out-of-place locations is fun, but the novelty wears off fast, especially when it feels like you're seeing the same characters in every damn level. And as I mentioned, the story is very bare bones, meaning character interactions are not really a thing. In fact, it's really only Jimmy and Zim that get lines of dialogue here. Jimmy gets it because he's playing the role of man in the chair, while Zim is revealed to be the mastermind behind the robot bosses. Weirdly though, and I may be remembering this wrong, I don't think the game ever explains why characters from different universes are colliding. Looking at a few plot summaries, it seems like it's just kind of ignored, which is weird. But hey, who needs proper character interactions and story when you've got Jimmy throwing a Fast and Furious style party at the end of the game? A little interesting note is that the game ends on a to-be-continued cliffhanger, implying that there's more to come in this story. This makes me wonder if the unreleased snapshot was supposed to function as a sequel rather than just a home console version of this exact game. Or maybe Altron genuinely planned to make a sequel. I guess Zim's storyline will have to remain unresolved. Visually, Freeze Frame Frenzy is okay. It's nothing great, but it's also not offensively ugly like, say, Attack of the Twonkies. It's just sort of meh, except for some rare moments like Tommy after this boss battle. Or just the fact that Tommy has the wrong coloured hair in this game. And then there's the soundtrack, which certainly exists, I guess, just completely unremarkable, like everything else in this game. It sucks to say it, but Freeze Frame Frenzy just isn't very good. This photography concept is tough to get right in video games. I can only stomach a small amount of Pokemon Snap before I'm well and truly bored of it, so stripping that game of all of its depth and nuance means my interest is going to be reduced even further. Freeze Frame Frenzy just doesn't have anything really going for it, but at the same time it doesn't have these dramatically awful aspects either. Having played it start to finish, I can easily see why it's become so forgotten and overlooked. Despite being a unique crossover game, everything is just so bland. It's not an aggravating experience, just kinda dull, so I'd recommend checking it out for an hour or so as it's a neat curiosity. But after an hour, you've seen everything it has to offer. Spend any more time with it and you'll just be bored. Freeze Frame Frenzy is such a unique idea and goes insane with the crossover elements, but it's really not that much fun. For me, this is a D tier game, pretty much saved by the fact that they went all out with the crossover.
Away from home.
So with every single game played and ranked, what are my thoughts on Nicktoons Unite as a series overall? Honestly, the series holds up incredibly well. Licensed games get a bad rep, and there are a lot of deserved reasons for that. But I think this series is a perfect example of why dismissing every licensed game as garbage shovelware is incredibly naive. The overwhelming majority of games in this series are passable experiences at worst, and almost every single one of them was made with care for the Nicktoons brand. As you can see, I have Battle for Volcano Island and Attack of the Toybots home console versions as the best games in the series, although Unite and Globs of Doom really aren't that far off. The home console versions had a surprising level of consistency. It's honestly extremely hard for me to pick a worst or best game out of these. As for the handheld side, Battle for Volcano Island stands out as both the best GBA game and the best handheld overall. Attack of the Toybots is definitely the worst, but the rest of the handhelds all sort of fell into the same middling tier. I think the easiest way to tell that the Nicktoons Unite series succeeded, at least for me personally, is that as somebody who was a Cartoon Network fan first and foremost, it makes me extremely jealous that we never got something like this for the cartoons. They'd even done the groundwork already with Cartoon Network City and crossovers in smaller Flash games. I guess it's my fault for not getting into Fusion Fall at the time. Unfortunately, licensed games are becoming more and more unpopular as the years go on. I've long since given up hope that we'll get a new Cartoon Network crossover game in the style of the Unite series. Hell, we might not ever see another Cartoon Network console game at all. However, Nickelodeon has weirdly been supporting the gaming space quite a lot recently. Since acquiring TMNT, there's been a steady stream of new game releases. We've got a bunch of crossover fighting and kart racing titles that just keep on coming. There are new Avatar and SpongeBob games in the pipeline. And to the shock of everyone who cares, there's also seemingly a new Nicktoons Unite game on the way. Nicktoons and the Dice of Destiny was revealed at this year's Summer Game Fest, and while it's not exactly a brand new Nicktoons Unite game, it definitely seems like it is in spirit. I cannot wait to get my hands on this game, and I'm praying that it can continue the respectable quality Nicktoons Unite has come to be known for. If you managed to make it to the end of this over 2-hour long video, I want to say a massive thank you, and also a massive thank you for your patience as I put together this video. Turns out it's not easy to put together a video that properly plays and reviews all games in the Nicktoons Unite series. If you'd like to support the channel and help it grow, please drop a like, comment, and subscribe. It's so cliche, but it really does help the channel reach new audiences. Until next time, later.